Chapter 26, 82 Fellow Slayers. The Wraith Armada advanced across the palace lake, followed by a swirling veil of mist. On the opposite shore, the Shades waited for their enemy in cold silence, aloof and indifferent to the eerie horror of the vast expanse of viridian glow converging upon them. Behind the ethereal fleet, covered by mist, rivers of mangled flesh were flowing and swelling like a sea on the eve of a terrible storm. The battle for the heart of the Eternal City was about to begin. Jet glanced back at the creepy silhouette of the titanic black moth sitting atop the magnificent castle. She could not see it, but felt the presence of countless strings connecting the dead deity to the silent warriors of the Shadow Army. From what she understood, Sunny was somehow using the moth to control his legion. Therefore, it was their true commander. Jet found herself playing the role of a simple foot soldier instead of a general. It felt a bit strange, after all these years of being in command, but also liberating. Finally, she could not worry about anything except wielding her blade and slaughtering her enemies. Like in the good old times. How nice. She smiled faintly, casting an icy gaze at the approaching armada. Her blue eyes seemed to glow chillingly in the darkness of the palace island as she beheld its dreadful visage. If it were me, I'd begin peppering them with arrows right about now. As if reading her mind, a black arrow suddenly streaked across the sky, coming from somewhere on the walls of the dark castle. It breached the distance to the Wraith Armada in an instant and bloomed into a blinding flash of a strange, radiant, silent explosion. The light swallowed multiple ships, erasing them from existence. Another one. Jet grinned. Even from a distance, she could feel that the ghosts were not merely vanquished and returned to the dreadful cargo hold of the Dutchman. They were truly and utterly obliterated, disappearing forever, just like those slain by her own hands had been before. She knew who the archer was as well. It was one of those few shadows that felt far more willful and sentient than the rest, the quiet, fearsome archer who was always surrounded by the dreadful scent of death. Jet had always sensed a kindred soul in her, and now she had confirmation. That one was a fellow slayer. The first arrow was like a trailblazer. As soon as the silent explosion of essence swallowed the vanguard ships, the entire Shadow Legion stirred. Soon, a dark cloud of projectiles rose into the air, raining down on the Wraith Armada from the black sky. Sadly, none of them was as lethal as Slayer's arrow. The silent legion of the Lord of Shadows mostly consisted of the Abomination Shadows, and while there were some of them capable of ranged attacks, most abominations only excelled in melee. So the Shadow Legion was most formidable in a direct clash. It was probably a good thing, too. It was not difficult to realize that all of these shadows belonged to beings whom the Lord of Shadows, Sunny, had killed. His domain was built on slaughter and death, so it was a relief to see that most of the shadows he subjugated belonged to nightmare creatures. There were some humans as well, but not many. Jet still remembered the chill she had felt when she saw the shadows of her former acquaintances standing among the silent shades, though. She had not been close to those people, but she knew them. Even if most belonged to the legacy clans, there had been too few powerful awakened before for them not to brush sides at least a few times over the years. Watching the Wraith Armada shrug off the bombardment and continue its advance without ever slowing down, Jet glanced at the Shadow Legion with a complicated expression. In fact, the shadows of people were not the only ones she had recognized. There were others as well. There was Goliath. There was an eerie thing hidden in the veil of snow, too. Jet had never gotten the chance to witness what the winter beast looked like, but she was almost certain that it was now dead and a member of the Shadow Army. Too bad, I wanted to kill it myself. There were various abominations of the chain of nightmares, those who must have come from the tomb of Ariel, and numerous more. Which posed the question, how had the Lord of Shadows come to possess these shadows? He had been veiled in secrets and mystery from the very start. No one knew where he had come from or how he came to be as powerful as he was. Nephi's and Cassie seemed to trust him, so Jet put his trust in him too. Plus, the man was quite likable once he took off his mask. There was something about him that put Jet at ease, a hint of familiarity that made her feel a strange sense of comfort when he was around, as well as a subtle note of unexplainable wistfulness. Maybe it was because he was a fellow outskirt rat, or maybe it was simply because he was immensely powerful and on their side, possessing a down-to-earth and easygoing personality. Even if, deep down, Sonny was definitely completely and utterly mad. Still, the vexing mystery of his existence gnawed at Jet from time to time. But whenever she tried to think about it deeply, her thoughts seemed to wander in some other direction. Most of the time, she did not even realize that there was something amiss with her thought process. Actually, the very fact that she only wondered about his past occasionally was an abnormality. But there were plenty of anomalies in the world of the nightmare spell. There were all kinds of bizarre aspects, powers, and flaws. Take Effie's husband, for example. Not even Jet could remember his name, despite how close she was to their family. Maybe Sonny suffered from something similar. In any case, it was good to have the Lord of Shadows on their side. Jet had wanted to get to know him better for a while now, driven by an inexplicable impulse that was more than simply curiosity, so she jumped at the chance to participate in an expedition with him. Granted, she had not expected to find herself facing an undying army in the middle of a sunken hell. Well, no, that was not really true. Actually, she had expected something exactly like that to happen. Watching the first wisps of mist reach the Palace Island, Jet smiled darkly. I guess it's time to prove once, and for all which one of us is the more terrible wraith. Despite it all, the expedition to the Eternal City promised to be worth it. Chapter 26, 83 Master of her craft. Just before the wraith ships reached the shore of the Palace Island, Neve summoned a peculiar memory that looked like a mass of translucent fabric. Taking a step forward, he spun and tossed the fabric into the air in one smooth, practiced motion. The memory soared high, unfolding into a vast net woven out of thin opalescent strings as it did. It glimmered with a shimmering light and expanded like an effervescent spiderweb. The beautiful net was hundreds of meters across, but as Neve tensed, it grew even more, covering a vast swath of the sky. Then it fell on the ghostly ships and blazed with multicolored flames, dimming their ethereal glow. In an instant, the core of the advancing armada was suddenly swallowed by a radiant, iridescent inferno. The opaline flames burned above the water and reflected on its surface. It was as if an explosion of vibrant colors suddenly invaded the black and silver majesty of the Eternal City, brightening the somber expanse of the lake. Of course, what mattered most was not the beauty of the shimmering flames. It was the fact that the spectral ships and the phantoms caught under the net melted in the colorful blaze, dissolving into its radiance. Compared to the great size of the ghostly armada, these losses were minor, but the opaline net broke the momentum of the first assault wave, buying the Shadow Legion some time. Looking at the colorful wall of fire burning above the water, Neve winced and bent down to pick up his harpoon. His indigo eyes seemed to shine with a dark radiance for a moment. Jet smiled lazily. "Where have you been hiding that memory?" He sighed. "It's my mother's aspect legacy. It is a powerful memory and could be exponentially so, but it consumes too much essence. There's no point in being frugal anymore, though this is do or die after all." Jet chuckled. "Don't forget to thank your mother when we get out of this hellhole." Personally, she was in the exact opposite situation. Neve had been rationing his essence and was now prepared to burn it all in a final confrontation. However, she had exhausted most of hers and was now hoping to replenish her reserves in the battle against the Dutchman. Jet had even resorted to consuming the souls trapped in the mist blade in order to survive the horrors of the Eternal City. All but one, that was. The soul of the heart of Kanak was too valuable to be wasted that way, so she had chosen to retreat and find safety on the bridge of the Night Garden in order to preserve it. So at the moment Jet felt, hungry, looking at the approaching ships, she grinned. "Stay alive, Neve." The mist blade assumed the form of a ghostly war scythe. In the next moment, the harrowing armada was upon them. Countless wraiths poured from the decks of the spectral ships, landing on the soil of the Palace Island. They seemed to be acting with some kind of strategy in mind, but whatever their goal was, the Shadow Legion did not give them a chance to implement it. The silent shades advanced, aiming to push the enemy back into the water, where myriads of hungry abominations awaited. Even if they would never be able to satisfy their hunger by devouring ghosts. As it had happened before, the champions of the Shadow Legion led the assault, causing havoc and devastation among the ethereal wraiths. The beautiful statue of a female knight, the towering fiend forged from blackened M. Edel, the formless creature who constantly changed shapes, sometimes turning into a colossal serpent. I suppose I'm an honorary champion of the Shadow Legion too, today. Even if she was of a lower rank than most of these immensely powerful creatures. The thought was amusing. Taking a deep breath, Jet lunged herself into the fierce crucible of battle. Her aspect was not at all flashy, and her powers were quite simple. Jet could absorb the essence of those she killed, bypass flesh to attack one's soul directly, and enhance her body with more essence than an ordinary awakened could. She could also turn into mist or assume the form of a wraith, and her shattered soul core always continued to grow, one jagged fragment at a time. After decades of strife and slaughter, it had become quite imposing. Her enemies in this battle were phantoms, though, so her awakened ability, one that had made her the infamous Soul Reaper, was meaningless. So was the Transcendent one, meaning that Jet only had two things going for her. She was far more powerful than a Transcendent was supposed to be, almost reaching the level of physical prowess one would expect from a Supreme, and she would remain inexhaustible for as long as she kept killing her enemies. That is fine. People like to tell tall tales about combat and warfare. There was no end to sophisticated philosophies and profound musings dedicated to the supposed art of battle, making it all seem far more complicated than it truly was. That was because people liked to feel enlightened and elegant even while doing something as barbaric as perpetuating ruthless violence. But in fact, there was no art to battle. It was at best a craft, and a very simple one at that, fit for a butcher, not an artist. And Jet excelled in her craft. Her craftsmanship was beyond compare, even. Instantly overtaking the foremost shades, Jet descended upon the disembarking wraiths like a hurricane of ghostly steel. Her war scythe flashed, causing the mist to part before it. The curved blade pierced the chest of a spectral warrior, obliterating it, then slashed in a wide arc to cut another one apart. As the two wraiths dissolved into ethereal light, Jet used the inertia of the slash to raise the mist blade high and then brought it down. Instantly, her somber weapon changed form, turning from a war scythe into a mundane one. With its blade now extending perpendicular to the shaft, it easily bypassed the block that one of the phantoms tried to make with its weapon and plunged into his head. In the blink of an eye, 3 of the Dutchman's wraiths were destroyed. Jet spun her scythe, deflecting several blows and forcing the enemies to retreat for a moment. Finally, a refreshing stream of essence flowed into her shattered soul. Inhaling deeply, Jet looked at the endless sea of eerie phantoms in front of her and smiled. Her icy blue eyes glowed with a chilling, killing intent. Goodness gracious, there's so many. It was a real feast. Chapter 26, 84 More Bad News. The Shadow Legion engaged the vanguard of the Wraith army on the Palace Island, making the ground quake and the lake swell with towering waves. The Dutchman loomed in the distance, drawing closer and closer. On the eastern shore, Nephi's landed gently at the very edge of water and leaned on the blessing, looking across the lake at the ruined vista of the Eternal City. The mysterious being hiding somewhere among the rubble had not revealed itself yet, slowed down by the crushing, but it was going to arrive soon. Cassie stood on the wall above the gates of the dark castle, resting her head on the hilt of the quiet dancer. She had removed her blindfold and was now facing the battlefield, the dying light of Neve's flames reflecting in her gorgeous blue eyes. Far in the distance, beyond the lake, the repulsive rivers of crushed flesh were slowly converging on a single point. I don't like it." Standing in the dead darkness of the gateway of the palace, Sonny glanced around with a complicated expression. He had an ominous feeling that the flesh of Kanakit had not shown them its worst, yet. "We should hurry." Nightwalker raised an eyebrow. "Hurry where?" The palace was immense, taking up most of the island. More than that, it was incredibly tall, with countless spires bound together by a complicated maze of aerial bridges. The spacious corridor they were currently in resembled an enormous metal tunnel, with no seams between its walls, floor, and ceiling. It was in a state of dire disrepair, with deep scratches covering every surface and an eerie dark mold growing in vast patches here and there. Ghastly black flowers bloomed in the mold, and the air was thick with dust and pollen. It was as if something enormous had made its way through the corridor once, smearing its walls with blood. The blood then dried up, and eventually gave birth to the sinister mold. If Sonny could unleash his shadow sense, he could haul. V scouted the entirety of the palace in an instant, but just like everywhere else in the Eternal City, His senses were suppressed, more so here than outside. He could barely perceive what was 100 meters ahead of them and did not feel what was behind the walls at all. Giving the swirling wisps of pollen a wary look, Sonny ceased breathing and answered in an even tone. "You're the Night Walker. Your people are known to be excellent guides, so why don't you guide us to the very heart of this damn place?" Nightwalker summoned a memory that resembled a square piece of deep blue fabric embroidered with silver thread, folded it once, and tied it around his neck. Pulling it to cover the lower part of his face, he inhaled deeply and shrugged. "No problem." Sonny blinked a couple of times. "Wait, really, I was joking." Nightwalker chuckled. "I think I mentioned that my aspect allows me to get to places." Sonny remained silent for a few moments. "Lead the way, then." He had almost expected Nightwalker to sit on the floor, meditate for a while, and then open some kind of mystical portal, but instead of that, the youth simply started walking. Sonny hesitated for a moment, then followed, careful not to step on the disturbingly thick mounds of mold growing on the floor. He was observing their surroundings with utmost caution, ready to repel any kind of attack. However, even after a few minutes, no abominations lunged at them from the darkness. Instead, he suddenly heard Cassie's voice in his ears. "Sonny," he frowned faintly, "did you learn something about the Dutchman?" There were a few moments of silence, and then she spoke again. "No, although I can perceive it clearer the closer it comes. It is about the flesh of Kanakhet." Sonny pursed his lips, suspecting that he was not going to like what she was about to say. "What is it?" Cassie's voice sounded glum. "It's evolving." Hearing that, Sonny almost stumbled. "It's what?" She seemed to sigh. "I think it has been on the precipice of evolution for a long while. Perhaps it gained something while battling the Dutchman, or perhaps resisting the crushing served as a catalyst. In any case, it's in the process of evolving from a great terror to a great titan, and the evolution is rapid. We don't have much time." Sonny cursed out loud, as if he had not already had enough on his plate. "A damn great titan, damn it." His expression darkened. Sonny had yet to battle a great titan, let alone kill one. He had spent a long time staring at the dark sea of the Forgotten Shore and planning to slay it one day, but that day still remained in the far future. "It's going to be fine. I killed a cursed tyrant once. Surely a great titan won't be any worse. Surely, even if it's immortal." His expression fell. Nightwalker glanced at him in confusion. "What are you cursing for?" Sonny exhaled slowly. He remained silent for a moment, then said in a low voice, "The flesh of Kanakhet. Apparently it's evolving." Nightwalker stared at him for a bit, then glanced away. "Ah, makes sense." Sonny gaped. "Makes sense? How the hell does it make sense?" His guide coughed, then shrugged. "Well, it's how things go. There is usually a pattern to how nightmare creatures evolve, you know. A demon has to develop unnatural powers to become a devil. A devil has to gain authority over lesser creatures and claim a territory to become a tyrant. A tyrant." Nightwalker paused for a second and grimaced. "You know how tyrants usually rule over minions, but abominations of higher ranks don't. That's because they don't need to exert their authority outward. Instead, they internalize it and become a complete being, a force in and of itself, self-contained and self-sufficient. Anyway, tyrants usually consume their minions to fuel their ascension to terrors. That's why terrors and titans rarely have servants." Sonny stared at him in puzzlement, wondering how this first-generation fossil had a better understanding of nightmare creatures than people of the third generation. In fact, those who had become awakened after the chain of nightmares were already being called the fourth generation, and they did not know any better either. In hindsight, what Nightwalker had said made a lot of sense, though. It also correlated with Sonny's own observations. Consume their minions, huh? What about terrors, then? How do they usually evolve into titans? Nightwalker grimaced. "Terrors usually have only one goal: to spread, to grow. But once they spread and grow enough to reach critical mass, they must do the opposite. They must consolidate themselves and evolve. That is how they become titans, only naturally very few ever do. And they need to fuel the final stages of their evolution with an enormous amount of soul essence, so it's usually a massacre of harrowing proportions." Sonny tilted his head a little. "Consolidate themselves." Strangely enough, minded him of how stars were born. Diffused clouds of gas and dust, of matter, had to reach a threshold of density to initiate gravity collapse. Then, in a terrible conflagration of heat and light, a star was formed by nuclear fusion. As Sonny pondered that, Nightwalker grimaced. The flesh of Kanak had spread to the entire population of the Eternal City thousands of years ago. I think it only lacked fuel to evolve, and the Dutchman delivered just that to this damn place. Sonny glanced down, fuming. That damn Dutchman. Taking a few more steps forward, he sighed. What the hell? That's cheating. I had to literally descend into the shadow realm and kill a dead god to become a titan. Nightwalker chuckled. Ha, you're a funny one. Sonny smiled bitterly. I'm not joking, though. I wish I were. Chapter 26, 85 Simple Choices. On the shores of the Palace Island, a legion of shadows was drowning in the sea of wraiths. The lake had become covered by billowing mist, glowing with ethereal light as an endless armada of ghastly ships glided across its waters. There were so countless of them that one could travel from shore to shore by jumping from deck to deck. Each ghostly vessel carried scores of imprisoned souls in its hold, and as soon as they reached the Palace Island, those souls were sent forth to join the battle. The island was being swallowed by mist, and the Shadow Legion was being besieged by the dreadful tide of wraiths. Jet had found herself plunging into the familiar heightened state of battle focus. The world had become both simple and profoundly intricate, void of emotions but full of calculated intent. There was no past or future in that world, only the present moment, only action and reaction, cause and effect, happening so rapidly that they were almost one and the same. Combat was simple. It was really the simplest thing in existence, both in principle and by definition. That was because combat only had two components, choice and execution. Execution was a foregone issue of matching action to its intent, while choices were easy to make by always striving for optimal efficiency. Efficiency of movement, efficiency of emotion, efficiency of thought. The most efficient move was always the most economical, the least wasteful, and therefore it was always the simplest. Made up of these simplest choices, combat was simplicity itself. Perhaps such an approach was not very elegant, but then again, the same people who critiqued Jet for lacking refinement were the first ones to tremble at the sight of her blade. So who cared? She definitely couldn't give less of a damn. The only thing that mattered was slaying the adversary and staying alive. Well, alive adjacent, at least. Jet felt very alive at the moment. That was because the mist blade had reaped countless lives, or whatever the wraiths possessed instead of lives, and raging torrents of essence were pouring into her starved soul. With every phantom she destroyed, more jagged fragments were added to her shattered core as well. Jet was a veteran of countless battlefields, but she had never reaped such a bountiful harvest of powerful souls. It would have been exhilarating if it weren't so daunting. If she had the capacity to feel exhilaration while chillingly making an endless amount of optimal choices. Time flowed slowly, each moment encompassing countless actions. Jet, meanwhile, moved with the speed of lightning, or maybe with the speed of the last electric impulse that traveled through the nerves of the dying before they were embraced by darkness. There were wraiths all around her. Their ghostly bodies were ethereal and insubstantial, but that did not mean that their weapons could not cut her, could not bring her down. So she had to stay ahead of an endless avalanche of deadly blows, either by staying on her toes and being faster than death, or by killing those who aimed at her faster than they could kill her. The mist blade was like a vicious and mercurial predator, sometimes biting like a stinger, sometimes cutting like a scalpel, sometimes turning into a shimmering sphere of slaying steel around her. Scores of wraiths had already fallen to her blade, and scores more would follow soon. A startling massacre even by her standards, especially considering how powerful these sinister phantoms were. And yet it was a drop in the ocean. The champions of the Shadow Legion, the living statue, the steel demon, the serpentine shadow, were in similar situations. The silent shades were holding ground against the tide of ghosts, but their number was slowly diminishing, while the army of the Dutchman seemed endless. The murderous archer was still raining down death and destruction from the walls of the dark castle. Neve was still alive and even doing well. He had found himself fighting side by side with a shade of a tall warrior who was clad in splendid armor and wielding a fearsome spear, displaying worthy of a supreme. They made for a lethal and peculiarly harmonious duo, thriving in the chaos of battle. But there were simply too many enemies for them to slay. Just how deep is the Dutchman's hold? How countless souls had that fiend swallowed and subjugated over the ages? And where had it come from? Jet did not really believe the story about a lovesick captain and a cursed treasure he had found. The demon of repose was not someone who inspired love. She was someone who inspired terror. She was the very definition of the saying that there were worse things than death. Similarly, the captain of the Dutchman did not seem like someone who had been blinded by affection. He seemed like someone who had been blinded by a callous, malignant hunger for power. Someone who had sacrificed his soul in pursuit of a clear and sinister intent. Jet knew people well, all too well, really, and she especially knew those who lusted for the corruption of power. She had only looked the captain of the Dutchman in the eye once, but it was enough to recognize what kind of being he was. What is that bastard doing anyway? He should be halfway across the lake by now. Jet leaped back to create some distance between her and the nearest wraiths for a brief moment, then looked into the distance. There, hidden in the mist. Her eyes narrowed. Just then the looming silhouette of the Dutchman vanished. No, it did not disappear. Instead, it turned into an eerie cutlass and fell into its captain's hand. Jet knew that because the captain of the Dutchman soared into the air in a breathtaking leap, breaching the remaining distance to the palace island and plummeting down in a whirlwind of viridian glow. A moment later, he landed in the shallows, rising a plume of foaming water, and cast the indifferent gaze of his distressing, sea-colored eyes at the struggling shadows. Jet pursed her lips. Crap. Chapter 2686, Twisted Truth. Crap. Sonny stumbled and leaned on the metal wall of the vast corridor to keep his balance. Sadly, there was mold growing on that wall, and as soon as his hand touched that mold, it started growing through his skin, too. Sonny stared at his hand, which was rapidly becoming something horrifying, then grimaced as he felt blood weave attacking the rapidly spreading mold with ferocious hunger. Not wishing to suffer the agony much longer, he turned his entire arm into a shadow, watched the disgusting black growths fall to the floor and stomped them. Then he made his arm tangible again, surreptitiously summoned the mantle, and encased himself in a carapace of black jade. The handy bracelet was still whispering into his ear by the time he did. Your shade has been destroyed. Your shade has been destroyed. Your shade has been... Sonny's expression turned somber for a moment. So it finally happened. He had finally met a being who could irrevocably obliterate his shades. The immortals of the Eternal City and the spectral warriors of the Wraith Army had failed to truly vanquish even one. But as soon as the captain of the Dutchman descended upon the Shadow Legion in person, wielding his ghostly viridian cutlass with practiced skill, a dozen of them were destroyed in an instant. The bastard was strong. In fact, he was terrifying. And that was not even Sonny's greatest problem at the moment. Nightwalker turned around to look at him questioningly. What happened? Sonny lingered for a few seconds. It's the captain of the Dutchman. He joined the fray, and he's a familiar face. Of course, Sonny had recognized the sinister fiend instantly. He changed a lot from the last time he had seen him, being a wraith and a nightmare creature on top of that, but it was difficult to mistake him for anyone else. The captain of the Dutchman was... Sonny, I know what the Dutchman is. Cassie's urgent voice made him sigh. So Sonny had recognized the captain of the cursed ship, while Cassie had gleaned what the ship itself was. How convenient. He inhaled deeply, a dark expression twisting his face. The helmsman of the Dutchman was none other than the bronze-skinned sea captain who had been one of the 9. The 9 again. He frowned. Their malignant traces seemed to be everywhere in the dream realm, often turning into obstacles standing in Sonny's way. Was the ill-fated relationship between them and Weaver still pursuing Sonny, even after he became fateless? Or was it simply that anyone who sought the heights of power had no choice but to stumble onto the echoes of their unspeakable sins? Regardless, he would have been happier to learn that the captain of the Dutchman had turned out to be some abomination than a corrupted ghost of one of the 9. Having faced Slayer in battle, Sonny could not help but feel phantom pain at the prospect of facing another. He let out another sigh. What the Dutchman is? Well, go on, tell me. Cassie answered in a moment. The well of souls, it's the soul of Kanakit. Sunny's eyes widened a little. Suddenly, a few pieces of knowledge clicked together, giving meaning to numerous of the mysteries of recent days. It was not a confirmed theory exactly, but he had a strong feeling that he was on the right path. The soul of Kanakit, the flesh of Kanakit. Nightwalker told them that the Dutchman had been hunting him for decades, because the map to the Eternal City was in his possession. And that old legend about the Well of Souls told the tale of a lovesick captain who had spent a lifetime searching for the Eternal City out of one-sided love for the demon of repose, only to be damned instead. But what if the truth had been twisted? Yuris of the Nine had been sent to infiltrate the Empire of War. Alethea had been sent to uncover the lies of the gods. Oro had received a mysterious mission that was supposedly the most distressing of them all. But what about the other 6? Orphan had been sent to kill Weaver. Emedin had been sent to Nether, so that Nether could rally his siblings and start the Doom War. Omer had been sent to convince Mirage to join. Those were 3 of the 9, receiving tasks having to do with 3 of the demons. Wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that the 9 had plans for the rest of the demons, as well? Dread, desire, and repose. No, wait, am I forgetting one? Sunny frowned, then shook his head. If the captain was not in love with repose, but instead needed to get close to her to accomplish his mission, then the quaint legend gained a far more sinister meaning. And as to why he would out the soul of Kanakit, sacrifice himself to it, and then subjugate it instead. Why, Sunny could come up with any number of explanations. The simplest of them was a desperate need to gain power. After all, the 9 had been meant to help the demons win the Doom War, and for that, they needed to walk far on the path of ascension. And while they were all fated, not all of them were Orphan, who had become someone who managed to kill the demon of fate twice out of sheer grit and determination. Some would have needed to asterisk out shortcuts to might and power. Fusing with the soul of a supreme cursed to immortality by Shadow God would have been one such shortcut. It had worked so well, in fact, that the Dutchman and its captain survived the Doom War, while neither the gods nor the demons did. However, they had not survived it unscathed. They had both fallen into the vile depths of corruption. Sunny scowled. How much of that man is even left by now, after thousands of years of being corrupted? It wouldn't be much. Which posed the question of why that fiend was still so obsessed with the Eternal City. The answer to that question was quite obvious, though. It was because the flesh of Kanakit was here. He had already subjugated the soul of Kanakit, but once one tasted power, no amount of it was ever enough. So, perhaps the captain of the Dutchman had grown dissatisfied with being a harrowing wraith. Perhaps he wanted to gain a dreadful body, too. Ah, damn it all. Sunny cursed under his breath. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine. No, wait, no way. The flesh of Kanakit and the soul of Kanakit were currently here, in the Eternal City. But wasn't the heart of Kanakit here, as well? Slain and trapped within Jet's mist blade, and if 3 of the ancient fiend's parts were here. Then Sunny had a suspicion about what the mysterious nightmare creature in the east was, as well. Chapter 26, 87 Mist Front. The captain of the Dutchman cleaved the formation of the Shadow Legion apart in an instant. The silent shades, which had seemed indomitable before, fell to his ghostly blade like autumn leaves. A moment later, the wraiths followed their commander into the breach, causing the dark phalanx to buckle. Not good. Ordinary shades had no chance in a clash against the sinister apparition. The champions of the Shadow Legion, meanwhile, were either too far away or preventing other sections of the formation from falling. Jet was the closest. Cassie was already whispering into her ear, relaying the new information about the Dutchman and its captain. Much stranger, though, was the fact that she heard the voice of the Lord of Shadows resounding in her other ear at the same time. He said, "You need to buy me time." Jet regarded the captain of the Dutchman for a split second. Gods. Somehow, it felt like he was coming directly for her. Sure, no problem. Her voice was even. Hearing its nonchalant tone, the Lord of Shadows let out a nervous laugh. At least one of us is calm, I guess. In any case, 4 of my incarnations are spread out around the battlefield. They are augmenting my warriors while suppressing the adversary. The Shadow Legion might be wiped out without them, but if you need me, I'll manifest them as avatars and come after the bastard myself." Jet smiled darkly. So he was offering his help. How caring. "No need." She paused for a moment, and then added in something that almost resembled hurry. "I mean, no need for now. Let's see how things go fist. If you see me getting absolutely destroyed by that thing, do come rescue me post-haste." She could not see Sonny, whose voice seemed to be resounding from the shadows, but suspected that there was a grin on his needlessly handsome face at that moment. Deal. Cassie had finished talking as well, which meant there was no more time to waste. To hell with it. Jet tuned into mist. Flowing between the silent shades like a torrent, she enveloped the battlefield and surrounded the great wraith from all sides. His cutlass glowed in the fog like an ethereal beacon, drowning the world with its ghostly chill. Then 2 icy blue lights ignited in the mist. That was Jet assuming her human form. Taking a step forward, she lowered her war scythe and looked the cursed wanderer directly in the eye. She smiled faintly. "I am the captain of the Night Garden's Soul Reaper, Jet. I was told to hold you off." The captain of the Soul of Kanakhet looked quite like a man up close, well, a ghost of a man at least. He wore the tattered remnants of a lavish robe and a spectral chainmail underneath. His long hair was swept back and tied into a careless knot, revealing a narrow forehead. His skin would have been bronze if it weren't ethereal and translucent, suffused with a pale glow. No one would have mistaken him for a human, though, because of the monstrous madness burning in the depths of his cold, inhuman eyes. Jet's smile widened a little. "But where's the fun in that? I think I'll just kill you instead." With that, she lunged forward. The captain of the Dutchman, the cursed wanderer, was not particularly powerful. In fact, he was a mere corrupted devil, or so Cassie had told. However, he had conquered and subjugated the great tyrant, Soul of Kanakhet, and stole its power. It was a strange situation, where a minion of a powerful tyrant had come to rule his master. Stranger things have happened. Jet was a saint who rivaled Supremes in terms of physical prowess, while the cursed wanderer was a devil who had taken the power of a great one for his own. They were supposed to be, if not equal, then at least existing in the same realm. However, practice was woefully different from theory. As soon as Jet attacked, she could feel a distressing wrongness to it all. The timing felt off and the space seemed twisted subtly. Her body was not responding to her commands as flawlessly as it should have, and her aim was slightly off. She was moving slower than she had expected. Her attack was weaker. It was as if the world itself was resisting her and aiding the nightmare creature. That felt suffocating. Jet could only compare it to how it had felt to be in the presence of powerful saints as a mere awakened. Their mystical presence had been like a physical pressure, threatening to send her falling to the ground. Similarly, the great wraith before her was exerting pressure. She knew what that pressure was as well. It was the will, the mysterious yet palpable force that those of the higher ranks knew how to wield. Sadly, although Jet was as strong as a supreme, she was not a sovereign. She could not even begin to imagine how to harness her own nascent will, let alone how to use it to suppress the influence of a far more ancient horror. But that was all right. Corruption must have rotted his brain. Having the will was neat, but the captain of the Dutchman seemed to have forgotten a simple fact, the simplest fact, really. In a battle between 2 skilled warriors, the one wielding a longer weapon usually won. Who asked you to turn the Soul of Kanakhet into a cutlass, idiot? Despite the world itself working against Jet, her war scythe reached the sinister apparition long before his sword could get anywhere near her. Granted, she was slower than she had hoped, and her aim was slightly off, but it still forced the cursed wanderer to block her attack with the blade of his ethereal cutlass. Jet had seen how easily that horrid blade cut down the shades, severing their inky black bodies as if meeting no resistance. After all, it was the Soul of Kanakhet, a being far more ancient and powerful than they were, a remnant of a frightening fiend who was almost as old as existence itself. But when the Soul of Kanakhet met the mist blade, a crack appeared on its surface, and the cursed wanderer reeled back. Finally, his mask of indifferent malice was lifted, revealing a rare moment of confusion and shock. Jet grinned. She was the Soul Reaper, after all. Her aspect allowed her to deliver tangible attacks to intangible souls. So why would anyone try to block her attacks? With the soul of Kanak hit. Chapter 26, 88 Third Contender. The cursed wanderer had not remained rattled for long. In fact, his shock only lasted a split second, then. He coldly pulled his cutlass away and moved forward, aiming to slip past the mist blade. He was so swift that time seemed to slow down to a crawl, with wisps of mist suspended in the air and unmoving. Of course, Jet was just as quick. She retreated at the same pace as he advanced, coldly calculating the odds. The shaft of her war scythe was long, so if she could just keep him at an optimal distance, the advantage would be hers. Conversely, if the sinister apparition got too close, she would die. So there was no way that she would allow him to move past the blade of her scythe. It is a bit funny, really. Here she was, fighting an eldritch horror in the heart of an eternal hell. And yet, the same principles that she had learned during her clumsy training spars at the academy could still decide the outcome of this fight. A thorough mastery of the basics had never let her down. The mist blade moved with swift and lethal precision, aiming to behead the great wraith. Usually, an adversary would have been able to easily deflect or block such an unsophisticated attack, but the cursed wanderer was wary of letting the soul of Kanak touch the ghostly scythe. So, he had to dodge instead. And to do that, he had to give up on his attempt to get closer. Jet smiled. "Why are you running away, though?" This time, it was the sinister apparition who retreated a step, and it was she who advanced. For a few seconds, the two of them turned into a whirlwind of mist and cold steel, both aiming to cut the other down. The ground of the palace island cracked under the strain of their clash, and the surrounding shades had to retreat lest they be destroyed. The advance of the Wraith army stalled and then halted. The broken formation of the Shadow Legion received a chance to repair itself. But before it could, the whole island suddenly shook, and a blinding flash of white light illuminated the sky behind the palace. Jet briefly glanced east. Nephi's. It seemed that the third contender had finally arrived. Shortly before, Nephi's stood on the eastern shore of the island, leaning on the blessing. The turbulent expanse of the palace lake stretched before her, and on its other side, the ruins of the eternal city were locked in a constant cycle of destruction and restoration. The rubble was obscured by billowing clouds of black dust, and something was moving there under its veil. Getting closer. What could it be? Nephi's did not know, but she felt something that she had not experienced in a long while. It was a hint of fear. The cold, insidious tendrils of fear crawled from under the wary apprehension that was familiar to her, making her heart ache. How strange. Was there still something in the world capable of frightening her? Even if there was, she saw no reason to assign that meaning to the unknown nightmare creature hiding in the black dust. So why was she afraid? Am I under some kind of mental attack? Nephi's frowned. Surely that had to be it. She wouldn't experience fear otherwise. Let's see what that abomination is, then. She raised the blessing, intending to channel her flames and burn the dust away. But just before she could, a vague silhouette finally appeared from the dust. It was the thing Nephi's feared. A man wearing a tattered spacesuit walked across the ruins while holding his hands behind his back. His face was obscured by the visor of the round helmet, but she could glean desiccated flesh through its cracks. The man halted for a moment at the edge of the water, then stepped on it lightly and walked leisurely across the surface of the lake. Neph's eyes narrowed. She remained motionless for a bit too, then quietly rose into the air. Flying to the middle of the lake, Nephi's hovered just above the water, holding the blessing pointed down. The strange man continued to walk until he was only a few dozen meters away from her, then stooped, looking at her from beneath the cracked visor of his helmet. There was silence between them for a while, and then a low, croaking laugh resounded from the tattered helmet. "Little Nephi's my lovely girl, you're all grown up." Nephi's did not answer. Then man studied her for a bit, then raised a hand tentatively as if wanting to touch her. His hand fell powerlessly back a moment later, though. "Won't you say hello to your Uncle Astor?" His voice almost sounded hurt. Neph stared at him silently, then a faint smile twisted her lips. "Is this what you think I fear?" The man shrugged slowly. "Love, hatred, fear, courage. Aren't they all human emotions? But we are not humans, you and I, we have never been human, and we certainly never will. Nephi's chuckled joylessly. Ah, I see. I guess that is what I fear as well. With that, she took a deep breath and stared at the man chillingly, white flames igniting in her eyes. It was a good attempt, but you are not Asterian. She tilted her head a little, and then add in an aloof tone. Although now that his name has been invoked, I guess he will be watching. Raising the blessing once again, she pointed it at the man in a tattered spacesuit and said evenly, "Let him see then. So what are you really? The mind of Kanakit, the thoughts of Kanakit, the folly of Kanakit, possibly." The man laughed. "Ah, a Nephilim. Of all the creatures in the world, why did I have to meet one of your vile kind?" Taking a step forward, he suddenly seemed to lose form, becoming vast and unfathomable. "What am I? Oh, the madness of Kanakit, that's what they called me." Nephi's nodded somberly. "I see, well then." The blade of the blessing shone with a blinding radiance, and the water of the lake boiled under the immolating heat. "Get the hell out of my head." In the next moment, the world exploded into a distressing, pure, merciless white inferno. Chapter 26, 89 Eternal Engine. The palace was an eerie and inhospitable place. The smooth metal corridors stretched endlessly, filled with nothing but destruction, eerie black growths of mold and spores. Nightwalker seemed quite confident as he navigated their complicated maze, but it almost felt like he was choosing directions at random. Sometimes they would go up and sometimes they would go down. Some corridors were angled at a steep incline, some opened into bottomless wells. Some were filled with unrecognizable debris, some were empty. In any case, the longer they spent inside the palace, the less Sunny was convinced that it was a place where a demon had lived. The unidentifiable debris could have been furniture, true, but it looked more like broken pieces of esoteric machinery. There were no spaces fit for mundane activities. The layout was inexplicable. It felt like they were traveling the metal bowels of a giant, dead beast. Sunny had been to several strongholds that belonged to the demons. They were all subtly strange, as if built for someone who was similar in shape to a human, but not quite the same, except for the Tower of Hope, whose master had lived among humans and favored them. The Ebony Tower, the Jade Palace, the Mirror Castle, and the Night Garden all shared that trait, though. The Palace of the Eternal City was entirely different. It seemed more like a complicated mechanism than a home. Perhaps it was. After all, the Eternal City was basically a colossal space station. It had been created to exist in the vacuum of space, so it would make sense that there was a sorcerous engine at its heart. Sunny could just imagine how the palace had looked when the Eternal City drifted among the stars. It would have shone brightly with silver light, powerful torrents of stellar flame and soul essence rushing through these corridors. The palace was dark and lifeless now, though. Still, that did not mean that its sorcery was gone. "What is happening out there?" Nightwalker's voice sounded a little glum. Sunny hesitated for a moment, then allowed himself to take a breath and used the air he inhaled to answer. "The wraiths are pushing my shadows back. Jet is fighting the Dutchman and its captor. Oh, the Dutchman is the soul of Kanakit, as it turns out. Nephi's is fighting the madness of Kanakit." Nightwalker stared at him silently, which prompted Sunny to add, "Neve is still in one piece." His guide turned away and grunted quietly. "Well, everything seems to be under control." Sunny sighed and shook his head. "Does it? I guess it is, for now. Sadly, one guest is yet to arrive." The Shadow Legion was holding back the wraiths, Jet was holding back the soul of Kanakit, and Nephi's was holding back his madness. All three battles were precarious, hanging in a delicate balance, but that was fine. What was not fine, however, was that the flesh of Kanakit continued its evolution as they spoke, and once it became a titan, the fragile balance would be instantly shattered. Not to mention if the pieces of Kanakit somehow merge. That'd probably be an unmitigated disaster. Body, soul, mind, and spirit. Those were all the parts of a living being Sunny knew of, except for the final one, Shadow. The flesh of Kanak, the soul of Kanakit, and the madness of Kanakit constituted the first free. The fourth one, the spirit, was with Jet in the form of the heart of Kanakit. A part of that devil was bound by the mist blade, while some of it had been fused with her shattered soul core. The shadow of Kanak was missing, but then again it was not supposed to exist. After all, Kanak had been cursed by Shadow God. A person's shadow was their death, so would a deathless being possess one. Yuri's did have a shadow, but it had felt like a hollow and lifeless thing, like a shadow of an object, not of a living being. What was going to happen if the other parts of Kanak had merged? Would that ancient fiend be reborn? That'd be suboptimal. Sunny did not even know how to deal with the flesh of Kanak aft, or its evolution, let alone the entirety of that undying bastard. So, it was in their best interest to prevent all parts of Kanak from coming anywhere near each other. It's a bit funny though, isn't it? Nightwalker raised an eyebrow. What is? Sunny shrugged. That we went on this expedition to find the wharf, the lineage of Storm God, the trace left behind by a nebulous demon, and some treasure, of course. There are so many things to be gained in the Eternal City, but the other two forces that reached it actually came for the monsters guarding the treasure instead. The captain of the Dutchman and the madness of Kanak did not care about all the things that Sunny had wanted to take. All they cared about was the flesh of Kanak, which was why they had entered the deadly race to the Eternal City. Time was of the essence. How far are we from our destination, anyway? Nightwalker lingered for a moment. We're here. Before Sunny could feel surprised, they stepped into a vast hall. It was unlike any of the intersections they had passed before, circular in shape and grandiose in size. A deep pit took most of its expanse, surrounded by giant shards of a violently torn metal plate, almost like a bowl with a broken lid. Or a prison with a broken seal. The hall was dark and empty, like the rest of the palace. The mold was much thicker here, and wisps of gray fog drifted above the floor. Just before Nightwalker stepped into the fog, Sunny grabbed his collar and pulled him back. Don't touch that fog if you want to live, Nightwalker frowned. Why, what is it? Sunny looked around and answered in a distant tone. It's nothing. Ignoring Nightwalker's confusion, he studied the heart of the palace with a dark expression. Eventually, a pale smile appeared on his face. I guess we found the cage where the flesh of Kanak had been locked. Chapter 26, 90 Empty K. The demon of repose had once helped overthrow a being that was as old and eldritch as her. Kanak, one of the original humans born from the sparks of the flame of desire, bearer of the Shadow God's curse, and the king of the first human kingdom. The first human domain. She was most likely the one who had separated him into pieces and sealed each piece away, as well. The Eternal City had held one such seal, in fact, containing the flesh of Kanak might have been its original purpose. Now the Eternal City had fallen from the black skies, and the seal was broken. Sunny was looking at the torn fragments of its lid right now. Nightwalker blinked a few times. Nothing, what do you mean by nothing? Sunny sighed. Well, demons were never above stealing. Nether in particular felt comfortable lifting any useful idea that had been carelessly left laying around, be it by his siblings or the gods. It seemed that the demon of repose took a page out of the divine book as well. Carefully avoiding a wisp of gray fog, he added. Nothing is what the gods used to seal the void. It is like a layer of insulation between the void and the bars of its cage, a state of absolute non-existence. Touch it, and you'll be erased from existence as well. He looked at Nightwalker and smiled. Unless you're someone amazing like me, of course. I once spent close to a year enduring nothing. It was a terrible experience, so I do not recommend. Walking to the edge of the vast pit where the flesh of Kanak had been kept, he looked inside and grimaced. The mounds of repulsive mold growing inside resembled eerie black hills, with peculiar flowers opening their meaty petals at the sound of his steps. A deep frown slowly settled onto his face. Nightwalker remained silent for a while, then asked, now what? Sunny looked at him darkly. Are you sure that this is the heart of the palace? His youthful guide nodded. Quite sure. Sunny looked away and scratched his head. Then I have no idea, yet. The battle was raging outside. Jet was barely staying alive, and Nephi's was fighting an ancient fiend proficient in mind attacks. No matter how formidable her mental defenses were, that made Sunny nervous. He had to solve this puzzle quickly. Nightwalker stared at him with disbelief. That's it, you had no plan. Sunny frowned. How was I supposed to concoct a plan without knowing anything about what sorcery repose used to create the Eternal City? I had reasons to believe that I'll be able to dismantle it, okay. He paused for a moment and then added, "A long time ago I taught myself Weaver's sorcery to interfere with the sorcery of hope. I was merely an awakened back then, knew close to nothing, and was sitting alone in a cage. Needless to say, I am vastly more powerful now. I know far more, can do far more, and have become a far better sorcerer. I also have the others like me. So I should be able to at least break whatever sorcery the demon of repose left behind." Sonny threw another look into the pit and sighed heavily. "The problem is that I need to lay my eyes on the inner workings of that sorcery first. Do you see the problem?" Nightwalker hesitated a little, then looked around. "There's nothing here. Everywhere we've been inside the palace is the same, dead and empty." Sonny smiled faintly. Yes, quite ironic, to find nothing but death and emptiness in the heart of an immortal city. He remained silent for a while, then closed his eyes. His shadow sense was still being suppressed, but he cast it as wide as he could, which wasn't very wide, really. There has to be something. The palace was obviously a structure created to channel a powerful sorcery. Sonny had been confident of that fact even before entering these walls, but after walking between them, he was sure. The demon of repose had built the eternal city around the palace. Every canal led to the lake surrounding it. The dome was highest above its spires. "Cassie, what is your intuition telling you?" Sonny used to have a supernatural intuition as well, but now that he was untethered from fate, it had become completely mundane. Cassie, meanwhile, had lost the ability to see the future, and yet she was still innately attuned to the great tapestry. She could sense the underlying connections between things, the intricate intersections of the strings of fate, the meaning hidden in them. So she was handy to have around, and since she practically lived in Sonny's head now, there was no need for her to be around even. Cassie did not answer immediately, then sent him a simple message. "Downed." Sonny sighed heavily. "Aw, damnation, I knew you'd say that." He looked at Nightwalker and summoned the helmet of the jade mantle. "Wish me luck." Nightwalker opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Sonny took a step forward and jumped into the pit. He landed into the mold, feeling it squelch and part under his weight. A black cloud of spores rose into the air, obscuring everything in sight, and the repulsive flowers moved, trying to envelop him with their petals. Sharp thorns scraped against his armor, leaving shallow scratches on it. Arg! It was disgusting. Breaking free of their hold, Sonny waded through the slithering mold, slowly making his way to the bottom of the pit. It was as if he was diving into an abhorrent mire. He had hoped to find what he was looking for there, buried under the mold. But to his disappointment, the bottom of the pit where the flesh of Canact had been sealed was no different from the rest of the palace. There was nothing there. No runes etched into the metal, no diamond strings, no streams of essence, no strings plucked from the tapestry of fate and twisting onto each other. Just a vast expanse of bent, corroded metal. However, Sonny's eyes widened a little. There was something beneath the pit, out there on the very edge of his shadow sense. What the hell? He could sense shadows. Thousands of them motionless, still, silent. They were shadows that belonged to living beings. Chapter 2691, Red Lake. "Lord of Shadows, Sonny, how much longer do you need?" Jet's voice sounded strained. The battle was still raging around her, and the Shadow Legion was slowly losing ground. The silent shades had already vanquished myriad wraiths, but no matter how numerous enemies they destroyed, more and more revealed themselves from the mist. What was worse, torrents of ethereal light sometimes escaped from the cursed wanderer's ghostly cutlass, infusing the mist with viridian glow. That meant that there were more wraiths still contained within the soul of Canact, possibly of them, and that the ranks of the undying army were constantly being replenished. Jet herself was barely holding on. Her battle with the captain of the Dutchman was furious, but at the same time strange. The great wraith was dodging and evading all of her attacks instead of facing them directly, while she did everything in her power to keep him at a distance. Despite the harrowing forces unleashed by their clash, neither had received a single wound yet. That was because one strike of the viridian cutlass was all it would take to kill Jet. The cursed wanderer, meanwhile, was simply too powerful and diabolical to allow her scythe to touch him. Jet had managed to build a solid defense through arduous effort. However, she could not mount an effective offense no matter how hard she tried. And she was trying truly hard, fighting both against the world itself and against her own limits. On the surface, this state of things was beneficial to her. After all, she did not really need to kill the sinister apparition. Her task was merely to hold him back. But in reality, the future looked more and more bleak with each passing moment. That was because battles of such intensity usually did not last this long. When a transcendent poured so much of themselves into the battle, going above and beyond to match the power of a superior adverse. The outcome was more likely than not decided in a matter of seconds. Jet, however, had been locked in a furious melee with the cursed wanderer for gods, she did not even know how long. The body and soul might have been unscathed, but her reserves of essence were slowly diminishing. Worse than that, she was growing tired. The encroaching exhaustion was not of the physical kind, but rather a mental one. It took a lot to maintain her mind in a state of utmost focus, and by now her intense concentration was showing signs of decay. She had not made a mistake yet, but at this rate, one was inevitable. And one mistake was all it took to lose one's life in the world of the nightmare spell, which was why Jay was trying to find out how much longer she needed to hold. This time, Sunny's voice did not resound from the shadows around her. Instead, Cassie whispered softly into her ear. He found a thread. Now he just needs to pull on it. There's no telling how long that will take, though. Keep fighting for a little more. Jet gritted her teeth. That's what she said the last time. At that moment, the cursed wanderer finally managed to get past her defenses. The mist blade was just a split second late, but that allowed the great wraith to evade it and lunged forward with chilling malice. Jet barely managed to position the shaft of her weapon in a way that prevented her adversary from impaling her with his sword. He did not try, though. Instead, the captain of the Dutchman took a rapid step and reached for Jet with his hand. The moment his palm touched the black leather of her armor, Jet screamed. No, it was her body that opened her mouth, threw her head back, and let out a terrifying wail. She had no say in it. In the next moment, it was as if an invisible wall slammed into her. Jet was tossed far back, collided with the silent shades, and fell to the ground. She spat a mouthful of blood and weakly rose to her feet. As she looked in the direction of the cursed wanderer, her expression darkened. What the hell is this thing? Out there on the other side of the palace lake, something colossal and terrifying was rising in the mist. Jet cursed quietly. I guess we've run out of luck after all. The rivers of mangled flesh that had been converging from all across the eternal city under the awful weight of the crushing finally fused together, forming a second lake, a viscous, red lake of blood and pulverized tissue. The red lake was made up from the obliterated bodies of all the corrupted immortals. It swallowed an entire island, drowning the ruins. Its surface seethed and rippled, enduring the pressure of the crushing. And then it began to swell. An enormous lump grew in its middle, rising high into the air. From afar, it looked as if a red mountain was growing in the heart of the eternal city. Then the mountain burst, and a colossal arm rose into the dark sky of this sunken hell. Jet paled. The bones were formed first, growing at a startling speed. Bloody marrow seeped down, escaping through rapidly disappearing seams. Then tendons wrapped themselves around the bones, followed by huge ropes of firm muscle. Patches of skin grew atop the muscles, but then something went wrong. Instead of covering the huge arm entirely, the patches of skin blackened and shrank instead. The muscles contorted and spasmed in a revolting display of deformation, and the bones were twisted. In the end, the colossal arm remained incomplete, or possibly simply different, towering above the ruins like a profane monument. Blood flowed down its immense length, and a rot was spreading through its tissue. The huge arm resembled that of someone who had recently been flayed. Then, it fell, allowing its palm to press against the ruins. And another one was unleashed. Together, they began to pull the body of the flesh of Kanakut out of the red lake slowly. Chapter 26, 92, Birth of a Titan. An enormous being slowly rose from the red lake, absorbing it. After the two gigantic arms, a back with a bent spine showed itself next. Then, the top of a bloody skill, uneven shoulders, and an endlessly stretching torso. Finally, two towering legs were formed from the last remains of the lake, ending in stumped feet. The being crawled across the ruins, pressed into them by the crushing. then opened its maw and let out a dreadful, deafening, tortured wail. The twitching muscles on the creature's gigantic arms contracted once again, and it slowly pushed itself off the ground. Hell! In the next moment, Jet had no more time to study the titanic figure of the newly evolved flesh of Kanakhet. The captain of the Dutchman appeared from the mist, and a split second later, his cutlass was already flying through the air to cut off her head. Jet felt like she was drowning in her own blood, but she still managed to evade, mumbling curses as she struggled to draw a breath. She had to dedicate her entire focus to battling the great wraith once more. And yet the image of the newborn titan remained in her mind, as if burned into it. That thing looked like a huge human, or rather, like a failed attempt to create a human. Its titanic body was horrid and misshapen and covered in patches of disgusting rot. The creature's skin was entirely missing, revealing contorting muscles that were constantly seeping blood. Its deformed skull was half buried in slithering flesh, with a lower jaw that hung askew, barely attached to the rest of its face with rotting cartilage. There was no intelligence in the deep, dark pits of its missing eyes, just bestial and hungry lights. Jet did not know whether the ghastly state of the flesh of Kanakhet was due to the crushing or simply due to the rot of corruption that permeated it. What she did know, however, was that the abhorrent thing was, without a doubt, a titan. As she fought the cursed wanderer, the flesh of Kanakhet slowly rose to its feet and straightened. Its size was so enormous that its head almost reached the roof of the invisible dome, the same size as the monumental edifice of the palace. Damn it! Things were not looking good for them. Out there across the lake, the flesh of Kanakhet let out another groan of agony and took an earth-shattering step forward. At the same time, the cursed wanderer landed another blow, sending Jet flying back. She fell on the ground and rolled, feeling blood streaming down her face. Her vision turned blurry as the blood got into one of her eyes, burning it. Not too far away, Neve's harpoon shattered, leaving him unarmed. The dark castle warily moved back as the Wraith army advanced up the shore of the palace island. The Shadow Legion was dwindling, and with every shade it lost, its eventual defeat seemed more and more cemented. In the east, hidden from view by the soaring mass of the palace, flashes of blinding white light were getting closer and closer to the shore. Nephis was being pushed back as well. Jet winced and spat out blood, turning into a wraith and shifting away to avoid the deadly blow of the Viridian cutlass. Assuming her human form again, she raised the mist blade and pointed it at the cursed wanderer tiredly. She wasn't feeling too well. "Sonny, are you perhaps about done?" There was a second of silence, and then Cassie's voice resounded in her head once again. "He needs a few more minutes." Jet sighed. At this rate, they'll all be dead in a few more minutes. The expedition and its reinforcements could face the madness of Kanakhet, the flesh of Kanakhet, or the soul of Kanakhet and its master, but not all of them at the same time. If they wanted to last several minutes in this hell, one of their enemies had to die. Looking at the cursed wanderer, Jet grinned and slowly lowered the mist blade. As she did, the long war scythe changed form, turning into a black khopesh and robbing her of her reach advantage. The mist turned frigidly cold, and a layer of ice formed on the shattered ground. She grasped her sickle sword and lowered her stance a little, looking at her adversary with a dark intensity. "Your heart once told me to surrender and succumb, you know." Her grin widened a little. Guess who succumbed in the end? As the flesh of Kanakhet took another step, approaching the palace lake, the cursed wanderer lunged forward. Jet did as well. In the depths of the palace, Sonny had stepped through the shadows and moved past the floor of the vast circular pit. There was nothing but solid metal beneath it, stretching for about 100 meters down. The reach of his suppressed shadow sense just barely allowed him to perceive a hollow space below, appearing under its ceiling. He cursed and prepared to plummet down. There was another great hall hidden under the sealed chamber, this one entirely circular in shape, with no doors leading into its vast expanse. Sonny expected to fall down, but to his surprise, he didn't. In fact, he felt oddly weightless, drifting in the air. Well, not exactly air. There was no air in the spherical hall to speak of, only the cold void of vacuum. There was no gravity, either, so Sonny found himself in a peculiar state of falling endlessly while standing in place. Summoning a tentacle out of shadows, he pulled himself to the roof of the hall or its floor, depending on perspective, and manifested another shadow in a thin layer on the sole of his boot, instilling an adhesive quality to its composition. Stepping onto the cold metal, he found himself sticking to it. He looked around. How is this possible? All around him there stood shadows. They were the shadows of the immortals of the Eternal City. Chapter 26, 93 Void Chamber. Cold. The vacuous chamber was filled with nothing but stark light, shadows, and unbearable cold. Even Sunny, whose supreme body was encased in the soulbound carapace of the jade mantle, could feel all warmth swiftly draining from his body. At the same time, he raised a hand. His palm was drowning in impenetrable darkness, while the back of his hand was shining with radiant light. It had turned luminous in the fierce torrents of blinding radiance that poured between the shadows, on the verge of turning to ash. Feeling his skin starting to blister beneath the sublime jade, Sunny grimaced and hid his hand in the shadows. The vast spherical chamber was drowned in the radiance of a fierce silver conflagration that burned in its center, suspended in the vacuum like a miniature star. In fact, perhaps it was a star, just like the one imprisoned inside the lighthouse. If so, this one was even smaller, so much so that Sunny could easily grasp it with his hands. Of course, he would be incinerated long before reaching its radiant halo. The vast emptiness of the chamber, the deep shadows, the luminous flame burning in the center of the dark void like a beating heart. It was like a miniature model of the void, and the flame of desire almost. The shadows of the immortals stood silently on the concave walls of the chamber, bathed in starlight, lonesome and lost. Most of them belonged to humans, but some resembled beasts. Some were small, others were vast. Some Sunny recognized, the rest of them were unfamiliar. He wanted to chuckle, but no sound escaped from his lips. After all, there was no air in the chamber, so nothing could carry his voice. So the old man was right, after all. Back at the lighthouse, Nightwalker joked that the demon of repose drew inspiration from the curse Shadow God had placed upon Kanak when designing the Eternal City. He turned out to be more right than any of them had imagined. This is her sorcery. Kanak had been denied death, cursed to exist forever devoid of its final embrace. Therefore, he did not have a shadow. Shadow God had taken it away. So this was how the demon of repose had created her immortals as well. She had separated them from their shadows and then sealed the shadows in the heart of the palace, preventing them from both returning to their owners and making the journey to the shadow realm. That was why the prisoners of the Eternal City were immortal. They could not die because their deaths existed somewhere else. Their deaths were in front of Sunny. Of course, he had no idea how the demon of repose had managed to sever living beings from their shadows without killing them. Neither did he know how she had been able to trap the orphaned shadows and overcome the pull of the shadow realm. Apart from that, Sunny could only guess why the buildings of the Eternal City endlessly restored themselves as well. What was sustaining the dome above the city? How was the destructive heat of the imprisoned stars contained? Was it harvested? And what means had the demon of repose used to realize her sorcery? Sunny did not know any of these details. However, he did not need to know all the answers to make a mess of things. Destroying something was far easier than creating it, after all. Especially because Sunny was uniquely suited to destroy this particular manifestation of divine sorcery. Before that, though, he had to solve another problem. A very serious problem. Damn it all. The void chamber had been created to trap shadows. And Sunny was a shadow. His shadow sense was flawlessly contained within the sphere of starlight and darkness, so he could not use shadow step. He could not travel to the waking world either. He could not summon his shadows or call upon his shades. In fact, he could not do anything to leave this empty place at all. The void chamber had been created to cut off a part of the world from the universal laws of existence, after all. It was a place that barred passages to the shadow realm, so how was a mere supreme supposed to escape it? Sunny remained motionless for a short while, then walked across the metal surface of the chamber's wall by alternating the adhesive nature between the soles of his boots. Reaching the nearest shadow, he reached out to it. Nothing happened when he touched it. Nothing happened when he commanded it to enter his soul and submit to him, either. However, when he cajoled and soothed it quietly, it hesitantly turned to him and then vanished without a trace. A new shade was added to his legion. That was promising enough. Sadly, it was also not going to help him make the dreadful immortals mortal once again quick enough, simply because there was a myriad of them in the void chamber, and he could not afford himself the luxury of convincing each one to submit individually. Sonny walked among the orphaned shadows, looking around intently and absorbing them into his soul one after another. He was searching for something, but at the same time he was thinking fiercely about how to escape this place. Eventually, Sonny stopped and lowered his head for a moment. Then he glanced up with a dark smile. All right then. It was not a problem. He figured out how to destroy the sorcery of the demon of repose, and the solution was simple. Since the orphaned shadows could not travel to the shadow realm, he was going to bring the shadow realm to them. As the light of the star burning in the center of the void chamber grew a little dimmer, Sonny raised a hand and summoned a particular memory. Of course, it was the shadow lantern. Thus spoke Weaver, "They will open the gates." Grasping the shadow lantern in his hand, he opened its gate. The gate of shadow drew his arm back, and then tossed the lantern toward the center of the chamber. As soon as the gate of shadow opened, it was as if an invisible ripple spread through the vast, vacuous expanse, as if a cold wind blew across the space that had no air. A powerful pull descended upon the spherical chamber like a reverse crushing. Of course, it only affected the shadows. All of them turned to the delicate stone lantern simultaneously. And then the first of them was suddenly sucked into its open gate. Chapter 26, 94 Call of Shad. Oh, crap. The shadow lantern was a divine memory, but it had always been subtle and understated. Usually, nothing flashy really happened when Sonny opened its gate. In fact, nothing happened at all. It was on him to either command or coax shadows into entering or call them back from the other side. That was not what was transpiring at the moment, though. As soon as the gate of shadow opened, a strange ripple spread through the void chamber, and the blinding radiance of the immolating star imprisoned in its center seemed to dim a little. A powerful pull descended upon the shadows, drawing them toward the shadow lantern, which drifted away from Sonny in the weightlessness while spinning slowly. Then, the shadow lantern suddenly froze in place, rooting itself into the world like a pillar of existence. That was when the trouble began. Everything seemed to stand still for a moment, and then the world shook. What the... Sonny lost his balance and fell to his knees. Raising his head, he glanced at the distant shadow lantern with wide eyes. Its small gate suddenly seemed vast and boundless like the realm of death itself, and the subtle pull it was exerting on the orphaned shadows turned annihilating. More than that, it was growing more overwhelming with each moment. Even Sonny was dragged into the air, only managing to hold himself in place by sinking the claws of his armored gauntlet into the metal floor. All around him, the shadows of the immortals, hundreds of thousands of them, were slowly floating upward, pulled toward the boundless darkness of the Gate of Shadow. It was like a dark, twisted version of the Rapture. The laws of existence had been defied by the stubborn will of the demon of repose for untold eons, and now, the universe seemed to be zealously correcting itself, using the shadow lantern as its conduit. At least that was what it felt like to Sonny, who found himself caught in that violent process. The fierce white star was still burning in the heart of the void chamber, but now there was an opposite singularity mirroring it, a flawlessly dark dot that was pulling everything toward itself. Shadows were pouring into the maw of the shadow lantern, and it seemed as if it was consuming the torrents of blinding stellar light with them. With every shadow that passed through the Gate of Shadow, the radiant light of the imprisoned star was growing a little dimmer. And not good. Sonny had thought that the shadow lantern was only exerting its pull on the shadows, but when the metal floor he was clinging to deformed and bent upward, he realized that he was wrong. The entire place seemed to be slowly imploding. Outside the palace, Cassie was standing on the walls of the dark castle. The harrowing battle between the allied forces of the Flame and Shadow domains and the dreadful union of the remnants of Kanakhet was raging all around her, but she was suddenly distracted by something else. A drop of something cold had just landed on her head. Raising a hand, Cassie brushed her fingers across her forehead and then brought them to her lips. She tasted salt, not blood, water. Raising her head as if wishing to gaze at the dark sky, she frowned. She had to wait for one of her marks to do the same before she could see anything. Drops of water were falling down on the vast ruins of the Eternal City, splashing against the rubble here and there, as if it was about to rain. Naturally, it was impossible for rain clouds to gather above the sunken city, which could only mean one thing. Sonny, what the hell did you do? It could only mean that the dome above the Eternal City was failing. His voice resounded in her head a moment later. Well, about that, do you remember how I promised to unravel the sorcery of repose, I think? Far away in the heart of the palace, Sonny's avatar rippled and turned int. Oh, the four-armed devil, using all his claws and even his tail to hold onto the bending floor. I think I succeeded a little bit too hard. Sonny cursed under his breath and rushed across the imploding void chamber, looking around frenetically. The luminous star was slowly losing its radiance, while the black gate facing it seemed to be becoming darker and darker. It was like a spherical rift in the fabric of existence by now, surrounded by a flowing halo of light that disappeared into its vast darkness. The void chamber was gradually growing smaller as it collapsed on itself. Where are you? Where the hell are you? Sonny's gaze was jumping between the floating shadows. His other senses were searching as well. He had almost made a full circle around the imploding chamber by the time he finally found what he was looking for. Found you! Sonny wanted to shout, but there was no air in his lungs, and none for him to inhale anywhere around. Hesitating for a moment, he let go of the deformed metal floor and launched himself into the air. The gate of shadow pulled him toward it with frightening force, but he had accounted for its draw already. Flying across the maelstrom of stellar radiance and deep darkness, he reached a particular shadow and grabbed it. Grabbing a shadow seemed like an impossible feat, but he willed his hand to do just that against all reason. Sorry, buddy, it's not time for you to find peace yet. The shadow he grabbed belonged to Nightwalker. Twisting in the air, Sonny manifested a heavy kunai linked to a black chain in his hands and threw it back toward the caving floor. The kunai pierced deep into the weakened metal, and Sonny held to the chain for his dear life, relying on it to keep him from falling into the frightening black hole of the Gate of Shadow. It was not time to leave the chamber yet. Hold on tight. He did not say those words aloud, and the shadow of Nightwalker would not have heard him anyway. But it seemed to grow still in his grasp. The void chamber was slowly coming undone around them. And around the chamber, the palace was coming undone as well. Chapter 2695, A Castle Built on Fog. A grotesque laughter surrounded Nephis as she flew above the lake, illuminating its turbulent surface with her radiance. She had long assumed the form of the spirit of flame, wielding the blessing to battle the madness of Kanakhet. The ancient nightmare creature was like a vast cloud of smoke and black dust that constantly changed and shifted, obscuring hundreds of twisted forms that seemed to be hidden in its dark depths. It had no claws, no fangs, and no hands to wield deadly weapons. However, it had no blood to be spilled, no heart to be pierced, and no head to be severed either. Its form was whatever madness consumed its enemies, and its power was whatever obsession made them weak. The delusions given form by the black dust wielded monstrous strength, capable of shattering mountains and ripping titans apart. What truly made the madness of Kanakhet frightening, however, was the terrifying onslaught of insidious mental attacks it unleashed upon its victim. Nephis could feel it as she invoked the name of destruction and channeled her flames through the blessing, summoning a fierce firestorm, a malevolent presence invading her mind to infest it with a ghastly delirium. Tormented by unbearable pain and dazed by the encroaching delusion, she chillingly commanded the storm of flames to swallow the billowing expanse of black smoke. The madness of Kanakhet laughed louder as it burned. Mores, burn me more, hurt me more. The vast cloud was incinerated, turning into a maelstrom of ash. However, a second later, the ash turned into smoke and black dust again, flowing forward like a flood to swallow her. That was the worst of it. No matter how many times Nephis destroyed the madness of Kanakhet, it never seemed to die. Did you know, Nephilim? An avalanche of devastating blows rained on her from all sides, forcing Nephis to dance in the air with her sword to defend herself. I've never met anyone as mad as you. Nephi's cut the world with her will, creating Arift in the boundless expanse of the madness of Kanakhet. She escaped its dark vastness and spun to deliver another strike. A torrent of white flame spanning hundreds of meters fell from above, severing the black cloud in two. As soon as it touched the water, a deafening explosion rang, and everything became enveloped in steam. I draw power from madness and your mind. Ah, what a delicacy! What a feast! A moment later, the madness of Kanakhet was already mended and rushed forward to push her closer to the shore. Nephi suppressed a groan, disoriented by the blinding pain of her flaw. She was usually better at enduring it, but her mind was weakened by the constant assault of the vile delirium. They had assumed that the delirium consuming her mind was strictly an attack meant to infect and debilitate her, but as it turned out, its main purpose was the opposite. It used her own mind to strengthen the madness of Kanakhet. Nephi knew that she was not the most normal person. Her desires had always bordered on obsession, and her resolve had always been far more extreme than that of most people. All people, really, as far as she could tell. On top of that, she was supreme, and all supremes had to be a little mad to sustain the heavy weight of their unreasonable defiance. So if the madness of Kanak drew power from the derangement of its victims, it could gain quite a lot from her. But Nephi's had invoked the name of passion at the start of their battle, adding fuel to her already scathing desires. That was a way to strengthen her will, but it had also inadvertently granted her enemy a far greater boon. No wonder the fiend was so dreadfully strong. It is strange, though. The madness of Kanakhet descended upon her like a swarm of horrors, making the lake boil. There is so much of you missing. Your mind is a ruin already through no effort of my own. Who maimed you that way? Nephi's measured the remaining distance to the palace island and frowned. How was she going to win this battle? What do you mean? Despite her torment and mental anguish, her voice remained even. A sinister growl resounded from within the harrowing black cloud, washing over her like a wave. There are holes everywhere here. There are things missing. It is as if someone tore out half of your heart and replaced it with fog. How can a castle stand on fog? Ah, I've never seen such a strange creature before. Nephi's hesitated for a split second. Was he talking about the gaps left in her memory after the tomb of Ariel? How did it know? And what did it know? No, what had that thing said? It had seemed important. That split second of hesitation was enough for a crushing blow to land on her radiant body, infecting the white flames with swirls of darkness. She let out a scream, which drowned in the grotesque laughter of the madness of Kanakhet. You and I are not that different, are we? Burning the infection out of herself, Nephi's allowed the pain to cleanse her mind and unfolded her wings. The black dust around her melted, and the smoke was immolated. Air itself combusted, causing a destructive chain reaction and creating a bubble of cold vacuum. Embraced by the deadly cold, Nephi's raised the blessing. At this point, the wisest choice was to release the name of passion and rob her enemy of some of its power. Her radiant figure blazed with merciless light as the air, the smoke, and the black dust rushed into the vacuum. You feed on madness. She smiled. Let's see how much you can eat, then. With that, she invoked the names. The name of hatred, the name of love, the name of despair, the name of courage, the name of wrath. She called upon every passion and its every shade, drowning herself in unbearable, overwhelming emotions. She let herself be consumed by madness. The madness of Kanakhet reeled. Chapter 26, 96 Cog in the Machine. What the hell, why is it raining? A heavy downpour was descending on the ruins of the Eternal City. The drops of water seemed to move slowly as Jet staggered back, barely keeping her balance. Her face was smeared with blood, and her body was broken, and yet she was still full of fight. Now that the mist blade had assumed the form of a khopesh, she did not have the advantage of reach anymore. The cursed wanderer was still avoiding letting their blades cross, which held him back, but he had managed to land far more attacks with his fists and feet now, as well as his elbows, knees, shoulders, and forehead. The bastard really knew his hand-to-hand combat. It was as if he had spent thousands of years doing nothing but participating in fistfights. How come? Groaning quietly, Jet turned her torso to avoid the ghostly cutlass and counterattacked, trying to sink her sword into the ethereal body of the great wraith. The rain made it harder to see. In front of her, the flesh of Canact had already reached the palace lake and stepped into it. The water barely reached its knees, and the enormous monstrosity waded through it, painting the lake red. Now that it was not slowed down by the crushing anymore, it was advancing faster. Around Jet, the Shadow Legion was being pushed back by the endless tide of wraiths. Worse than that, the army of silent shadows was also shrinking. There were barely half of them left by now. Behind Jet, meanwhile, was she imagining things, or were the walls of the palace faintly bending inward? What did he do? She could not be sure, but was pretty much convinced that the Lord of Shadows had done something insane. Not that it mattered to her at the moment. All that mattered was defeating the soul of Kanakit and its master. Jet forced out a smile as she dove under the whistling cutlass and tried to strike it with the mist blade from below. The cursed wanderer pulled his sword back with impossible speed, easily avoiding her trap, and slammed his palm into her abdomen. Arg! This time, something vital ruptured inside of her. A torrent of blood flowed from her mouth, and Jet staggered back once again. Can you give me a moment?" She grinned through the pain. The sinister apparition did not wait until she recovered naturally. He moved forward, intending to use her wounded state and finish her off. If one thought about it, getting beaten that badly but somehow failing to die was quite an achievement. Then again, she had been dead this whole time. The cursed wanderer was making a mistake if he thought he could cut her down that easily, though. He must have made a judgment about the power of his enemies based on what the silent shadows and the champions of the Shadow Legion could do. But Jet was neither. Jet was a proud subject of the human domain. So just as her body was about to fail her, a soft glow suffused her skin, and a pleasant warmth permeated her body. Embraced by Nef's purifying flames, Jet was healed and mended, restored to flawless health. That was the blessing of the human domain and its radiant, distant ruler. That was the power of the immortal flame, of the unquenchable longing. Of course, Nef's power was not absolute. She had to be paying attention to heal those who served her, and even her boundless supply of soul essence was not really inexhaustible. However, Jet was one of the special few who always enjoyed her attention. That was her privilege as a former member of Changing Stars' cohort and an irreplaceable cog in the great machine of humanity. The cursed wanderer did not expect his enemy to suddenly be healed, so he fell into a momentary disadvantage. That was Jet's chance to end this fight, or at least lay the foundation of his defeat. Sadly, she failed. No matter how unexpected her recovery was, the great wraith was simply too powerful to be taken down. He easily avoided the mist blade, then unleashed a flurry of attacks upon Jet. Deadly attacks rained on her from all sides, as if the bastard was in several places at the same time. By the time severed drops of rain fell to the ground, Jet was bruised and battered once again, and white radiance enveloped her figure once more. Damn it! She threw a calculating gaze at the approaching colossus of mangled flesh. Time was running out. In fact, there was almost no time left at all. Which meant that she had to do something drastic. The hilt of the black kopish lay comfortably in her hand. This was the form of the mist blade that contained the soul of the heart of Kanakit, the most powerful soul in her possession. Because of that one soul, the mist blade was akin to a supreme weapon of the fourth tier, instead of being equal to Jet's own rank and class. It also infused the mist blade with a special ability. All souls it bound did, but the heart of Kanakit granted Jet an especially potent one. It was the ability to stop the flow of time for everyone except herself for one heartbeat. Needless to say, such an ability was incredibly deadly. However, it was not without drawbacks, the main being that it consumed pretty much all of her essence. For somebody else, that might have been merely inconvenient, but for Jet, it was fatally perilous. It meant that she had to be certain that she would be able to kill something in that single heartbeat. If she did, their death would nourish her arid soul. If not, she would die instead. The risk was real and palpable. The situation, however, was similarly desperate, and since Jet had known that it would become desperate, she transformed the mist blade into a kopish in advance. Can kill that fiend instantly. Jet wasn't sure, but she was willing to find out. Chapter 2697, Wraith Gambit. Cassie, that thing is getting closer. Out there beyond the calamitous battle, the flesh of Canact had already reached the middle of the lake. The dream gate had long vanished, and nothing stood between it and the shattered shore. The titanic horror gazed down, an eerie malice emanating from the dark, bleeding chasms of its empty eye sockets. Its dislocated jaw swayed, putting strain on the elastic bands of muscle holding it in place. What the hell, damn, why is this thing so creepy? Jet retreated from the ghostly blade of the cursed wanderer, knowing that she could not escape it much longer. The dwindling formation of the Shadow Legion had been pushed back, retreating all the way to the walls of the dark castle. If she took another step back, their defeat would become inevitable. Don't worry about the Titan, Jet. You have enough on your plate. Jet smiled. Cassie was undoubtedly right. Torrential rain was falling onto the ruins of the Eternal City. The Ivory Island was frozen in the dark sky above the palace, surrounded by cascading waterfalls. The Pal. Ace itself was slowly collapsing in on itself, its metal walls groaning as they bent inward. Just then, another blinding white flash illuminated the world. This time, however, it did not dim, only growing brighter. It was as if a sun was rising from behind the crumbling palace. The Eternal City was welcoming day for the first time since it sank to the bottom of the storm sea. It seemed like Nephi's was getting serious. It's now or never, I suppose. Jet glanced at the cursed wanderer with cold, calculating malevolence. Could she do it, could she not? The bound soul of the heart of Canact granted her the ability to freeze time for a single heartbeat. At least that was how the spell described it. A heartbeat was an unreliable measure of time, though. Different hearts beat at different rates depending on the circumstances, after all. Jet's heart, for example, did not beat at all at times. So it would be more accurate to say that she would be able to move in the frozen time for a single moment. Could Jet slay the sinister apparition in a single moment? She did not know. Worse than that, she did not know if the cursed wanderer would remain still when she froze time. He had usurped the power of the soul of Canact, which meant that he had also usurped its will. And those who wielded the will could often resist the powers of those who did not. As Jet looked at the cursed wanderer, her gaze kept being drawn to the ghostly cutlass glowing with an ethereal viridian glow in his hand. The soul of Canact. Just then it flashed with a cold halo of viridian light. The light drowned in the mist, and countless spectral figures suddenly became visible in it, ready to join the Wraith army's assault. Ah, to hell with this. She lunged forward. What's the worst that can happen? I'll die. Jet could not help but smile at her own joke as she delivered a recklessly powerful downward cut with the mist blade. The great Wraith avoided it easily by taking a step back. A moment later, he would regain solid footing and use the opening created by her reckless attack to launch his own, probably delivering her a deadly blow. But Jet reached into the mist blade and activated the ability granted to it by the heart of Canact. That deadly blow would have to come in 2 seconds, no one. The flow of time around her came to an abrupt halt. The gigantic, monstrous figure of the flesh of Canact had stopped mid-step. Drops of rain froze in the air. The mist ceased its swirling advance, suffused with ethereal light. The flood of eerie wraiths became a motionless canvas. The crumbling phalanx of black shades became a still painting drawn against its background with ink. The soul of Canact was slowly swelling with another flash of viridian light. In the frozen time, only one thing moved, Jet. She pulled her sword back up, aiming to pierce the cursed wanderer's chest. But then the sinister apparition suddenly moved as well. Slowly, he shifted his gaze and stared directly at Jet. His torso began to turn, and the hand holding the ghostly cutlass started to move forward. Bastard! Jet tried to calculate if she would be able to strike him still. Would one strike be enough? The cursed wanderer was a corrupted devil, which meant that he had 4 soul cores. Souls usually collapsed long before all of their cores were destroyed. But would the same hold true for a wraith, a naked soul infused with malevolent will? Can I cut him 4 times in 1 heartbeat? Jet felt that she could, even if she was not entirely confident. But her gaze kept turning to the soul of Canact. In the end, she wasted her heartbeat to consider it silently, and then turned into a wraith herself. Time resumed its flow. The flesh of Canact took a step. Drops of rain fell to the ground. The mist swirled as it washed over the ferocious violence of the battle between the Shadow Legion and the Wraith army. The ghostly cutlass shot toward Jet's heart, however it never pierced it. Because as soon as time resumed its flow, the mist blade slashed across the cursed wanderer's wrist, severing it. The sinister apparition's hand, as well as the soul of Kanakite grasped in it, soared into the air. Reaching forward, Jet grabbed the hilt of the ghostly cutlass. As soon as it was in her grasp, she dashed back while holding both swords in her hands. The mist blade in one, the soul of Kanakite in the other. Jet created some distance between herself and the cursed wanderer, then landed on the ground and glanced at him with a dark smile. "You did not like that, did you?" The great wraith silently lunged forward. He was a little bit late, though. Jet glanced down at the hand that held the soul of Kanakite. Somehow her hand looked even less substantial than usual. It was rapidly growing blurred, like a wisp of mist being dispelled by the wind, and drawn into the ominous Viridian cutlass. Jet's smile dimmed a little. "Crap." In the next moment, she vanished in a flash of ethereal light. The ghostly cutlass clattered to the broken ground. Chapter 26, 98 Metal Coffin. In the void chamber of the palace. What used to be the void chamber, Sonny let out a silent scream as the vast space around him was slowly turning into a narrow metal coffin. It felt like the fabric of reality itself was coming undone around him as the shadows, the light, and the world itself were being drawn into the impenetrable black maw of the Gate of Shadow. The star that used to burn in the center of the chamber was barely giving off any light by now, having turned into a luminous sphere of liquid flame. With every moment, it was growing dimmer and dimmer. The chamber itself, meanwhile, had long lost its spherical shape. Its walls bent inward in jagged mounds of folded metal, coming closer and closer together. He was still clinging to a black chain, holding to it with all his supreme strength. However, the smaller the void chamber grew, the closer he came to the halo of flowing light that surrounded the shadow lantern. Sonny had no faith in the strength of the chain, either, even though he had manifested it himself. Damnation. Throwing a tense look at the terrifying black rift of the Gate of Shadow, Sonny gritted his teeth. In truth, he did not have to fear the shadow lantern. He could simply let go of the chain and fall into its gate, traveling to the shadow realm with the rest of the shadows. In fact, that would even be beneficial to him. It was going to take a bit of time for the shadow realm to destroy all these orphaned shadows. So in the meantime, he could draw more of them into his soul and establish a new contingent within the Shadow Legion. But there were two reasons why Sonny was stubbornly refusing to let go. One of them was the shadow of Nightwalker that he was holding in one of his 4 hands. He was still hellbent on bringing the legendary hero of the first generation back from the dead, and the shadow was most likely Nightwalker's ticket home. So, Sonny refused to sacrifice him to the final mercy of the Shadow Realm. The second reason was the subtle, but familiar sensations he started to feel once the walls of the void chamber started to cave. It was the feeling of his blood responding to something that was hidden nearby. Sonny could not be sure, but he was quite confident that the fragment of Weaver's lineage was somewhere here, in the crumbling chamber. The problem was that he could see no obvious place where the fragment would be hidden. After all, the void chamber was simply a hollow sphere of metal with smooth walls. Unless Weaver had placed a piece of his lineage into one of the shadows, there was seemingly nowhere here to hide it. Damn demon, that damn demon! Struggling against the irresistible pull of the Gate of Shadow, Sonny strained his muscles and grasped the black chain with 2 more of his found hands. Then, muttering silent curses, he arduously pulled him up its length. The walls continued to collapse as he did. "Hold there, buddy." The shadow of Nightwalker dangled from his 4th hand, seemingly indifferent to what was happening around it. The Gate of Shadow was drawing it into the darkness nonetheless, so Sonny had to endure twice the attraction. Sonny climbed the chain slowly, reached the deformed mess of metal that used to be smooth once, and sank all his claws into it. The shadow spawn form was perfect for hanging from the ceiling, so he managed to brace himself against it and hold on. Must hold. The void chamber used to be vast, but now the formless chaos of its bent walls was drawing close to each other. The ancient metal seemed to be rippling and flowing like a current, as it was drawn closer and closer to the shadow lantern, losing integrity in the process. Sonny could already feel weaknesses in the metal, jagged rifts that led into the depths of the palace, away from the collapsing chamber. He was not ready to try to escape into one of those rifts yet. It was growing darker around him. Soon enough, the entire palace was quaking. Feeling its death throes and observing the deluge of rain outside its breaking walls, Sonny came to a curious conclusion. He realized that the shadows imprisoned in the void chamber were not only how the demon of repose had made living beings immortal, but also the source of power that fueled the sorcery of the eternal city. The shadows fueled the star somehow, and the star powered the sorcery of repose. Now that the shadows were escaping into the realm of death, though, the star was weakening. And as it weakened, so did the eternal city. All parts of it, including the protective dome that kept the storm sea at bay. That's problematic. There was no telling what kind of dreadful devastation would befell the eternal city once at least a small part of its dome failed completely. The fierce star burning in its heart seemed on the verge of bane. Extinguished by then. Its radiant radiance dimmed so much that Sonny could actually look at it without being blinded. Which he did, searching for something with fervent intensity. Don't tell me. And there, previously obscured by the blinding light and currents of incinerating stellar flame, Sonny saw a black dot that was not supposed to exist. He stared at it for a few seconds, stunned. Weaver, that bastard. Had the nebulous demon hidden a part of the forbidden lineage in the heart of a damn star? Sonny knew that he was probably not supposed to be surprised, let alone appalled, but nevertheless he was. He was certain that the small object hovering in the very heart of the dying star was the fragment of Weaver's lineage. So, now, all he had to do was grab it without turning to ash and escape this place in one piece. Chapter 26, 99 Event Horizon. What to do, what to do? Clinging to the crumbling shell of the void chamber, Sonny peered at the vaguely noticeable item hidden in the heart of the dying star. The world was coming undone around him as the hungry maw of the shadow realm devoured it. The integrity of the imploding chamber had been compromised a long time ago, allowing air to rush in. Because of that, he could hear once more. What surrounded him was a deafening, penetrating, dreadful hiss that was low and loud enough to sound like a fierce roar. It was as if he heard the otherworldly voice of the shadow realm itself. And since the shadow realm was the corpse of the god of death, Sonny wondered if that was what his voice had sounded like as well. The metal was groaning as it was torn and pulled apart. What Sonny remembered while looking at the dying star of the eternal city was not the shadow realm and its cold expanse, though. He remembered the conflagration of divine flames burning in the endless expanse of the sky below, and the pain he had suffered after being burned by them. Was he going to burn once more today? Even if I am. Let's do it, I guess. Gritting his teeth, he summoned a pair of black wings and then let go of the chain. Immediately, the pull of the gate of shadow grasped him like an inescapable vice. Sonny found himself plummeting down, or perhaps up with awful speed, barely able to control the direction of his fall, or ascension. As he drew closer to the dying star, terrible heat washed over him. Then the heat became unbearable. And then it became impossible. Arg! Sonny regretted inhaling, because his lungs were instantly seared. His wings caught fire first, black feathers igniting and turning to ash a moment later. The jade mantle withstood the stellar radiance for a while, but then incandescent cracks slowly spread across its surface. The outward layers of the stone-like metal began to melt. The shadow of Nightwalker grew smaller, shielded from the blinding light by the towering figure of the shadow spawn. And it all hurt like hell, naturally. Aw, damn it, I miss Antarctica. Sonny wanted to be buried in ice. He wanted to go on a snowy expedition with Silent Stalker again. Instead, nearing the ferocious white orb of the dying star, he gritted his teeth and spread his burning wings to fight the pull of the gate of shadow. His fall slowed, even if only for a moment. But that moment was enough for Sonny to steel himself and plunge his arm into the stellar flame. The stone-like metal of the jade mantle finally melted. His flesh melted, too. However, even with his bones showing through the blackened flesh, Sonny still willed himself to grasp the fragment of Weaver's lineage hidden in the core of the dying star. He tore it out and wasted a split second to look at what it was. A scroll. It was an elegant scroll made of fine spider silk. There was no time to study it yet, though. Sonny only needed to confirm that this was, indeed, the fragment of Weaver's lineage he had come here to find. And judging by how his blood responded to it, it was. I'll read it later. He would unfold the scroll when the palace was not crumbling around him, when a great titan was not breathing down his neck, and when an army of wraiths was not besieging his shadow legion. Even if a small, irrational, and exceedingly curious part of him kept screaming to read the scroll right now. That's all the initial goals of the expedition achieved. Sonny allowed himself to feel a brief moment of satisfaction. He had come to the Eternal City to repair the Night Garden, recover Storm God's lineage, find the sixth piece of Weaver's lineage, and loot some treasure. He had done all that. Now, only one goal remained, one he had discovered after arriving at his destination. Get Nightwalker out of the Eternal City. About that, Sonny released his form, tuning into a vast and shapeless shadow. That made him more susceptible to the pull of the Gate of Shadow, but it also made him far greater, size-wise, so much so that he brushed against the collapsing walls of the void chamber. Powerful tendrils of darkness pierced the jagged metal near one of the rifts in it and pulled him toward it. Sonny had to exert all of his titanic strength, but that helped him avoid the event horizon of the Gate of Shadow and reach the distant wall. There he built the onyx serpent shell around himself and the shadow of Nightwalker. Pushing his prodigious body into the rift in the wall of the void chamber, Sonny slithered away from its crumbling expanse and burrowed into the maze of tears created in the frame of the palace like a worm burrowing into an apple. The twisting, irregular tunnels moved and changed form, closing and opening as he rushed through them. The molten surface, the jade mantle sent rivers of sparks flying as it scraped against the jagged edges of torn metal. It only took him a dozen moments to reach what had been the sealed chamber of the collapsing palace, once the great hall where the flesh of Kanak had been imprisoned. It had changed a lot since Sonny left it. The floor of the vast chamber caved, and the pit was oddly deformed. Nightwalk One was hanging from its edge, trying to get away from the hills of mold below. Black clouds of spores made the air hazy, and something that seemed like sunlight was pouring from somewhere, illuminating the nightmarish scene with pale light. When Nightwalker saw the head of a giant serpent rise from the darkness of the pit, his eyes widened. What the... He did not finish the sentence, though, because Sonny opened his maw without ever slowing down. And swallowed him. Chapter 2700 Starbeast. What the hell? Relax. In the cavernous darkness of the giant snake's maw, Nightwalker rolled on something slick and hard, then jumped to his feet. Then, as a nonchalant voice resounded from the shadows around him, he lost his balance and fell again. That was because the dark cave he had found himself in was swaying. That voice, though, why did it sound familiar? Sunless. Slithering through the crumbling corridors of the palace with astonishing speed, Sonny chuckled inwardly. Junctions and intersections flashed past him in a blur, and the walls that groaned and bent threatened to suffocate his shell in a crushing embrace. Yeah, it's me. I just assumed a different form. Welcome to Sonny Express, Lord Nightwalker. Somewhere in his maw, Nightwalker carefully sat up and glanced around with a resentful expression. You could have, it's a metamorphosis ability, I get it. Sonny was confused for a moment. People usually call it the transformation ability, actually, or one's transcendent form. But how would Nightwalker know? He had been stuck in the Eternal City for decades. There had been no saints during his glory days, let alone colloquial terms to describe things that had to do with transcendence. So he would have had to come up with his own terminology. Technically, the onyx serpent shell was not Sonny's transcendent ability, but since Nightwalker had not posed his comment as a question, he was under no obligation to explain the difference. Speaking of transcendent abilities, though, as Sonny reached a seemingly bottomless stairwell and sent his serpentine body down its vertical expanse, he realized that he actually knew very little about Nightwalker, aspect, and abilities. There had been little time to ask, and it was a sensitive subject anyway. Asking another awakened about their flaw was considered exceedingly rude, while asking them about their aspect could go either way. Colleagues had to share what they could with each other, naturally, but it was always a little awkward. After all, everything you revealed could be used against you. Then again, Cassie definitely knew what Nightwalker was capable of already, so Sunny could simply ask her. But why would he when the man was right there? By the way, what is your own transcendent form? Actually, what can your aspect do? Nightwalker hesitated a little, prompting Sunny to add. It's just that we're about to fight a great titan, so I thought I'd be nice to know. His youthful guide sighed. Well, I guess it's only fair. You showed me yours, I show you mine. Sunny almost spat the bastard out. He did not like that phrasing at all. Nightwalker chuckled. My aspect is on the stranger's side, though. It's a bit difficult to wrap your head around. My dormant ability is a form of divination, I suppose. I have this feeling that tells me where to go to get to where I want to go, or where to find what I am searching for, like intuition. Sunny nodded mentally. That made sense. It was an understated but unquestionably powerful ability. In fact, it might just be the most potent dormant ability he had ever heard of, considering what kind of challenges Awakened usually faced in the dream realm and in the nightmares. Cassie possessed a similar kind of supernatural intuition, albeit hers was far less specific, and or not as powerful. There were benefits to her more vague but general sense, though, because while it did not clearly tell her where to go in any given situation, it did tell her where not to go from time to time. Nightwalker's ability did not, which was a fatal flaw. The man, meanwhile, continued. My awakened ability is, how do I explain it? It's like a magical containment suit. Only there's no suit, it's just that my body becomes isolated from the environment. So I can be impervious to all hazards for as long as I have essence, cold, heat, radiation, contaminants, pressure, and so on. At the same time, my body becomes self-sufficient, producing its own oxygen and nutrients, something like that. Basically, I can go pretty much anywhere without dying. Anywhere reasonable or only faintly unreasonable, at least. What the... Sunny vividly imagined Nightwalker just comfortably floating in space in comfortable pajamas, stargazing. For a moment, he felt a hint of envy. That was basically any explorer's dream ability. Lucky bastard. What about your ascended ability? Nightwalker smiled. I can fold space. If Sunny had eyelids at the moment, he would have blinked. Huh. Nightwalker shrugged. Simply put, I can fold it to make something long short, or unfold it to make something short long. It's a bit tricky and there's a lot of applications, an infinite amount, really, but with some practice you can get amazing results. Taking one step and walking 100 meters, for example. That was how we reached the center of the palace so quick, by the way. I folded space to make each of our steps count for a dozen. Sunny felt a strong desire to scowl. No, but how does it even work? And he had not even felt anything peculiar. That's a cheat ability, not fair. If anyone heard his thoughts at the moment, they would have probably commented that hypocrisy had a name. Nightwalker, meanwhile, added with a hint of malice in his voice. Or, I can fold the space that my adversary occupies, or a body part of theirs, so it's quite useful in combat as well, Sunny sighed. No kidding. There was indeed an infinite number of ways that ability could be used, from traversal to fighting to even things like creating hidden storage spaces. If Nightwalker had not been the founder of a great clan, he would have made for a peerless smuggler. So, transformation. Nightwalker scratched his nose. Well, I call it the Starbeast. Sunny was a little confused. What is that? Nightwalker shrugged. Just like it sounds, a strange beast made of starlight. Light is both a particle and a wave. Similarly, my transcendent form can be both tangible and intangible, or shift seamlessly between the two. It's a bit silly, but if there were animals grazing or cosmic radiation and gravity waves while drifting from star to star through the endless dark void, that is what I imagine they would look like. Sunny remained silent for a while. Eventually, he said in a disgruntled tone, and you were surprised when I turned into a big snake. Nightwalker blinked a few times. Hey, it's not every day that I am swallowed by giant snakes, okay? He paused for a moment, and then raised 3 fingers in indignation. In fact, if one remember correctly, this is at best my 3rd time. Which was 3 times too numerous, as far as he was concerned. Chapter 27, 01 Pursuit of Mortality. The palace seemed to be on the verge of collapsing by the time Sunny reached its bent, misshapen gates. Actually, he wasn't even sure that the palace could collapse. Normal buildings were built out of brick, wood, or stone. Those in the waking world, meanwhile, were built from cement or metal frames covered by alloy plates. When damaged enough, they crumbled. The palace was simply cast from metal, though. There were no seams on its towering walls, and no distinction between its numerous spires. It was like a titanic organ built from countless hollow pipes. Sonny was not sure what music would be produced if the palace ever sang, and had no idea what its destruction would look like. It was not an idle interest, either. He needed to know in order not to get buried under the debris. Now is not the time to wonder, though. The giant serpent slithered out of the palace like an onyx river and coiled briefly on the open space between its gates and the walls of the dark castle. Then it vanished, leaving only Nightwalker, his shadow, and Sonny behind. The shadow remained motionless, while Nightwalker rolled across the cracked stones with a stifled curse. Sonny, meanwhile, just stood there for a moment, looking at the silk scroll held in his blackened, charred hand. The rain felt soothing on his skin. A moment later, the scroll disappeared without a trace, transported onto the altar of the replica of the nameless temple standing upon the dark waters of his lightless soul. What the hell is that? Nye. G.H. Walker was sitting on the ground, staring at his shadow with a strange, mournful expression. It was as if he himself did not understand the bitter feeling of sorrow and longing that the shadow invoked in him, and was confused by that uninvited emotion. Sonny sensed a deep, indescribable longing emanating from the shadow, as well. The two clearly wanted to be mended and become whole again, to become one again, even if neither of them had the capacity to realize that desire consciously. What a touching reunion! It seemed like a deeply meaningful scene, a man longing to reunite with his death. There was probably some kind of conclusion about human nature to be drawn from it, but Sonny was not really in the mood for philosophical ponderings. His burned body hurt too damn much for that. Lowering his hand, he responded with a shrug. "That is your shadow." Sonny approached Nightwalker and added in a subdued tone. "Long story short, the Eternal City claimed you by separating you from your shadow. So if we attach it back to your soul, you'll be able to leave." He scrutinized the shadow silently. "Of course, you will also become mortal again." Nightwalker looked around. The mountainous edifice of the palace was slowly collapsing in on itself. The entire world seemed to be swallowed by blinding radiance and white flames in the east. A myriad of wraiths was besieging the dwindling formation of the Shadow Legion. A great titan was marching toward them across the lake. And on top of that, the invisible dome holding the obliterating mass of the Stormsea back was on the verge of breaking. Even if one tried really hard, it would be difficult to come up with a worse moment to suddenly become mortal. Nightwalker grinned. "Sounds great, let's do it." There was a profound sense of disbelief hidden behind his carefree tone. It seemed that he had never taken Sonny's promise to help him escape the Eternal City seriously. At least that was how Sonny interpreted a hint of hopelessness reflecting in Nightwalker's silver eyes. He nodded slowly. "Can I even do it?" Well, that was a meaningless question. Sonny was a supreme, so if he decided to do something, his will would make it happen. His word was law in the most literal sense, as long as he could enforce that law upon the world. Before getting to work, Sonny spent a few moments evaluating the situation on the battlefield. The Shadow Legion was slowly being wiped out, but his expression changed subtly. Cassie, where is Jet? None of his incarnations could sense her presence. The response came shortly. She was swallowed by the soul of Kanakit. Sonny's eyes widened. She was what? 4 of his incarnations were supporting the Shadow Legion and were therefore present on the battlefield, but he was not omniscient. The reach of his shadow sense was limited in the Eternal City, and most of the northern expanse of the Palace Island was enveloped by mist now. On top of that, wraiths barely cast shadows. So Sonny was having trouble perceiving the ghostly soldiers and their leader, as well as Jet herself, when she assumed her transcendent form. Which was why he had lost track of her for a bit. "What do you mean she was swallowed by the soul of Kanakit?" Cassie responded succinctly. "I'm sure she'll be fine." It would have been more reassuring if she still had the ability to see the future. Sonny gritted his teeth. "It's Jet, it's Master Jet. She knows what she's doing. He was uneasy, but knew that he had to do his own part at the moment, especially because there was not much time left. The dome of the Eternal City was coming undone, the damn ghost army was on a rampage, and the flesh of Kanakhet was drawing closer. The whole place was about to collapse. All of these problems could be easily solved, though. All Sonny and his companions had to do was run. While preferable, nothing dictated that they had to slay the flesh, the soul, and the madness of Kanakhet. Now that Sonny had gotten what he wanted, they could simply leave the three eldritch abominations at the bottom of the storm sea and escape. The only thing standing in their way was the fate of Nightwalker. As soon as Nightwalker and his shadow were reunited, Sonny would have far more options as far as the end of this expedition was concerned. So he glanced at the youthful immortal and smiled. "Hey, stay still." Nightwalker raised an eyebrow. "Okay, but why did you say it so ominously?" Sonny kneeled near him, outstretched a hand, and summoned a memory. Moments later, Weaver's needle fell into his grasp. "Because I am going to sew you and your shadow back together. Oh, it might hurt, but don't worry." He smiled pleasantly. "You won't die." With that, 4 inky black hands manifested at his sides. The 4 hands wove a thread out of shadow essence. The charred arm hung limply, while the second of the original hands held the needle. Sonny T. Ook a deep breath. And got to work. Chapter 27, O2 Shadow Seamster. How had the demon of repose separated living beings from their shadows? Sonny had no idea. That shouldn't have been possible. She was not Shadow God, after all. In all Sonny's years, he had only witnessed something similar once. He had met the lost shadows that belonged to the companions of the First Lord of the Bright Castle at the boundary of the underworld. Sonny still did not know what exactly had happened to them. All he knew was that it had something to do with either nothing or nothing creatures. Come to think about it, there were wisps of nothingness drifting in the central hall of the palace as well. Perhaps that had something to do with it. In any case, Sonny was uniquely suited to resolve the fate of orphaned shadows, both back then and now. The shadows severed by the demon of repose were being drawn into the shadow realm at the moment. There, they would return to the natural cycle and be reduced to pure essence, which meant that the immortals of the Eternal City would become mortal again. Actually, no, that was not right. They would not become mortal, they would die. All the bodies that comprised the flesh of Kanakhet would perish. Sonny doubted that it would bring the great Titan down, though. He did not believe that it cared whether its flesh was dead or alive. After all, it never had. The immortals made for perfect hosts for the malevolent parasite not because they were alive, but because they were undying. Similarly, the flesh of Kanakhet itself was not going to die. That was because it had never died in the Eternal City, and its shadow was not in the void chamber as a result. The sorcery of the demon of repose was not holding it back. Or rather, the sorcery that had held it back was long gone. The barrier built by Daron did contain it, though. For now, at least, it had been created to prevent a great terror from being unleashed upon the world, not a great Titan. In any case, Sonny and his companions would still have to fight the flesh of Kanakhet. With the sorcery of the Eternal City failing, however, its body would not be healed in an instant, and it would not be raised from the dead either. So they at least stood a chance. That was the extent of his current concerns about the shadows drawn into the shadow lantern. One shadow remained, though, the shadow of Nightwalker. Unlike the rest that had to be returned into the embrace of death, that one had to be returned to its original owner instead. But since Sonny did not know what sorcery the demon of repose had used to sever it, there was no clear way to reattach it. It was not like he had no relevant experience, though. Surprisingly enough, Sonny had done something similar to what he wanted to achieve once. It was during the creation of the blessing. Back then, he had sewn the shadow of the sword to the shadow of its wielder in order to connect its physical vessel to its spellweave. It had not been easy, considering that he had to bend the world to his will to succeed. However, Sonny had indeed succeeded. Mostly because his will had already been tyrannical enough, but also because he used Weaver's needle and possessed authority over shadows. After all, he was the Lord of Shadows. Sonny had been a transcendent terror back then. He was a supreme titan now, and his will was therefore far more terrifying. So if he wanted to sew Nightwalker's shadow back to its owner, no one could tell him that it was impossible. It was in his purview to decide what was possible and what was not, to begin with. I doubt it will be effortless, though. Laying the shadow of Nightwalker over the inanimate shadow that followed him around, Sonny peered into his soul and saw the splendid radiance of his star-like core. Then he reached forward and pierced Nightwalker's soul with his needle. Nightwalker gritted his teeth, then let out a curse so dirty and inventive that Sonny almost blushed. What the hell? I did not know those words went together. Settle down, it's just the first stitch. There was far more coming. Nightwalker glared at him silently. Then get on with it. Smiling faintly, Sonny did. While one of his avatars was busy reattaching an orphaned shadow to its other half, 4 incarnations of Sonny were supporting the Shadow Legion in its desperate battle against the Wraith army. To be honest, I am a bit disappointed. Sonny had hoped that his legion would be able to repel the myriad of souls unleashed by the Dutchman. However, the actual outcome was somewhat expected. After all, the captain of the Dutchman had spent thousands of years accumulating his forces. Sonny, meanwhile, was not even 30 yet. What will I become in a few thousand years, I wonder? How vast will my legion be? Well, by then, he would not be the sovereign of death anymore. He would simply be death. So, his legion would presumably consist of everyone who had ever died, if he were to survive at all, naturally. The situation is troubling. The number of shades was dwindling. His shadows were wounded. The formation of the Shadow Legion was pressed against the walls of the dark castle, barely wide enough to defend it. Nephi's was still fighting the madness of Kanakhet, but Jet was nowhere to be seen, which meant the cursed wanderer was free to wreak havoc. However, Sonny had just a plan in mind to turn the situation around. It required him to make a little sacrifice, but promised a bountiful harvest in return. No sense in wasting time, then. A second later, 3 of his incarnations abandoned the Shadow Legion, leaving only the one augmenting the puppeteer behind. Robbed of their support and of the dire boon granted by the curse, the silent shades suffered. More of them were being killed now under the onslaught of wraiths, and fewer enemies were vanquished. The inevitable defeat of the Shadow Legion was brought closer. But that was, hopefully, all right. The 3 incarnations manifested black wings and soared into the air. They were flying toward the palace, whose walls were torn and split open by then. A few moments later, the incarnations dove into one of the rifts and disappeared from view. Chapter 27:03 Last Hurdle. The Shadow Legion had been pushed against the walls of the dark castle and diminished to barely a third of its size. The mist that threatened to swallow it had been held back by an appalling blizzard for a while. But now that the shadow of the winter beast was vanquished, it enveloped the world. The defiled Seeker had fallen, and even the elusive Ember Queen was littered with grievous wounds. Neither the Shades nor the Wraiths left bodies behind, and the palace island kept repairing itself no matter how terribly it was shattered and broken. But the battle that was taking place on its shores had been truly cataclysmic, more so than any battle Sonny had ever participated in. And he was losing that battle. His legion had been at a disadvantage to begin with, and that disadvantage continued to grow exponentially as more and more Shades were vanquished. Things took a truly drastic turn only when he pulled back 3 of his incarnations, though. Devoid of their support, the formation of the Shadow Legion started to melt at a dire speed. But even that was not the most pressing issue. That bastard. The most pressing issue was the cursed wanderer and the eerie sword he wielded, the great tyrant, soul of Kanakhet. Before the flesh of Kanakhet arrived, that was. Now that Jet was gone, there was no one left to stand in his way, which meant that he could utterly decimate the formation of the Shadow Legion. Worse still, the sinister apparition did not simply vanquish the Shades, he could truly destroy them. Sonny could not allow that to happen. The problem was that he did not have a lot of options left. The Shadow Legion was already barely holding on, or failing to hold on, rather, and very few of his warriors could slow down the cursed wanderer, let alone contend against him. Sonny could command Saint to bar his path, for example, but that would only cause the section of the formation she was supporting to collapse. What to do? Did he have to face the Great Wraith personally? Only 2 of his incarnations were outside the palace. One was busy attaching Nightwalker to his wayward shadow, while the other was augmenting the puppeteer. Sonny could potentially abandon the gigantic moth and manifest himself onto the battlefield, but that would mean surrendering precise control of the Shadow Legion. The result would be just as disastrous as doing nothing. I just need to buy time. He considered his options feverishly, trying to determine the optimal solution, then rapidly settled on the best one. Down on the battlefield, the cursed wanderer picked up the ghostly cutlass from the ground and straightened slowly. He cast an aloof gaze at the crumbling formation of the Shadow Legion, and then headed toward it with unhurried steps. An obsidian wasp dove at him through the pouring rain, and he casually bisected it with an effortless slash. His gaze climbed higher, finally settling on the dark figure of the colossal moth perched atop the highest tower of the magnificent black castle. The cursed wanderer regarded it for a moment, and then his cold, sea-colored eyes ignited with a dreadful malice. The sinister apparition continued forward, casually slaughtering the shades that tried to get in his way. Until a lightning-quick blade struck from the veil of rain, sudden and entirely unseen. The cursed wanderer only reacted at the very last moment, rapidly raising his cutlass to block it. The impact actually pushed him several meters back, and the ground behind him was shattered in a long and jagged line. He remained motionless for a moment, then righted his posture and glanced ahead. There, hidden in the rain and swirling mist, a dark figure. Yor stood, staring back at him with a ruthless intensity. Her ebony body was encased in a suit of light armor, and her face was obscured by a veil. She wielded a short sword in one of her hands, and as the sinister apparition watched, she unsheathed another. Both blades slowly swelled with a blinding glow, illuminating the mist and outlining her slender figure. She was the shadow of Orphan of the Nine, Slayer. Sonny had commanded her to abandon the walls of the dark castle and descend onto the battlefield. Who was better suited to confront the ghost of a fallen member of the Nine, after all? The ghostly face of the cursed wanderer remained motionless, but something changed in the depths of his sea-colored eyes. A hint of recognition appeared in them, painted by an inexplicable emotion. His lips, which had remained sealed for thousands of years, moved slowly, as if straining to whisper a forgotten name. But in the end, no sound came from them. Indifferent to the subtle movement, Slayer lunged forward with harrowing speed. A trail of shattered raindrops was left in her wake, and the mist flowed in a turbulent stream around her. The cursed wanderer shifted and met her attack with indomitable strength, causing a flash of light to drown everything around. The shining swords and the ghostly cutlass danced a lethal dance, guided by my malevolent will and boundless killing intent. The litany of ringing steel echoed in the mist, fusing into a dreadful melody. The shadow and the wraith exchanged 100 blows in the blink of an eye, shattering the ground around them completely. Slayer did not manage to gain the upper hand. In fact, she was pushed back a few steps and forced into a defensive stance. However, she had not been defeated either. For a few seconds at least, the dangerous clash seemed to hang in fragile balance, which meant that the cursed wanderer was temporarily contained and held back from reaching the formation of the Shadow Legion. And that was all Sonny needed, because by the time Slayer could not hold the sinister apparition back anymore, he would have had enough time to turn this entire battle upside down. Chapter 27:04 Turning the Tide. Slayer engaged the cursed wanderer in a lethal duel, which bought the Shadow Legion some time. But sadly, not a lot of time. Even if she continued to hold the sinister apparition back, his army of wraiths was still assaulting the weakening formation of the Silent Shades. Saint, Fiend, and Serpent did their best to repel the enemy, but even their great strength was not enough to turn the tide of the battle. Soon enough, the formation was going to break. The wraiths were going to wash over scattered shades, obliterating them. Then they would assault the walls of the dark castle, bring them down, and slaughter its defenders. Lastly, Sonny would be left to face the horrors of the Eternal City alone, having lost both his shades and his shadows. He would probably be able to save Neve, but the incarnation sewing Nightwalker and his shadow together would be interrupted, dooming the legendary founder of the House of Night. That was unless the flesh of Kanakit reached the Palace Island first and fused with the soul of Kanakit, dooming all of them. The ghastly mountain of bleeding flesh was already looming close, wading through the boiling lake with deceptively slow steps. Now that it was closer, its titanic size felt especially daunting. The flesh of Kanakhet was not exactly on the same level as condemnation, but close to it, standing as tall as the palace. Actually, now that the palace was collapsing, it was taller than it. The abhorrent titan could easily reach the roof of the failing dome with its hand, which meant that it could reach the ivory island as well. It could also tear off the enormous wings of the puppeteer or crush the entirety of the dark castle under one foot. How are we even supposed to fight that thing? Sonny knew that he would manage, somehow, if push came to shove, but he was not looking forward to that particular battle. He would have to survive the Dutchman, and the Wraith Horde first to get the chance to survive against the flesh of Kanakhet, though. East of the Palace Island, Nephi's and the madness of Kanakhet were still locked in a furious battle. Sonny did not know what was going on there, but judging by the blinding radiance that enveloped the eastern sky, she was going all out. The situation seemed hopeless, but luckily it was not. Continuing to stitch Nightwalker and his shadow together, Sonny smiled darkly. Good job, Slayer. He had bought himself enough time. Out there on the shattered battlefield in front of the dark castle, the formation of the Shadow Legion shifted faintly. The towering gates of the castle opened, and then, suddenly, rows of new shades marched out of its maw. Hundreds of them at first, then thousands. Most belonged to humans, but some belonged to magnificent beasts. And, LL of them were exceedingly powerful. Sonny's smile widened. Well, naturally they were. After all, they were the shadows of the immortals of the Eternal City. At the same time as his burned incarnation had begun to stitch the orphaned shadow to Nightwalker, the rest entered the collapsing palace. In an ironic twist of fate, or lack thereof, he rushed back to the Shadow Lantern immediately after escaping it. His avatars rapidly reached the Void Chamber. What had been the Void Chamber, rather? It did not exist anymore, having fused with the great hall above it in a mess of darkness and torn metal. The dying star was barely an ember, and the black rift of the Gate of Shadows seemed to have grown hungrily in size. The three incarnations dove into its impenetrable darkness without ever slowing down. Arg! Entering the Shadow Realm, Sonny was immediately blinded. The vast expanse of black dunes was usually shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the distant radiance of the essence storms. However, at the moment, he was surrounded by turbulent currents of essence on all sides, bathed in luminous light. It seemed that an essence storm was being born at that precise moment, in front of his eyes, all around him. Countless shadows were moving slowly in the blinding radiance, slowly dissolving into billowing torrents of essence. They were the shadows he had liberated from the prison built by the demon of repose, delivered to the realm of death after eons of captivity. The shadow realm was rending the shadows rapidly, as if time was catching up to them. He was not going to be able to recruit them all, but with 3 avatars acting as his heralds, he would be able to recruit numerous. Enough to turn the flood of the battle, at least. And that was what he did. Now, thousands of immensely powerful shades emerged from the gates of the dark cast like a black torrent. They flowed around the formation of the Shadow Legion and descended upon the wraiths from the flanks, crashing into them like an obliterating wave. Compared to the myriad of ghostly soldiers, there were not that many new shades joining the battle, but each of them had been cast by an immortal dweller of the Eternal City. They were all tremendously strong, vastly increasing the power of the diminished Shadow Legion. Enough so to break the balance of the battle entirely. The Shadow Legion had been losing before, but now it suddenly had the advantage, pushing the ethereal warriors back. Countless wraiths were slaughtered in an instant, and more were being destroyed every moment. Even the mist seemed to reel back, repelled by the fury of the calamitous clash. Somewhere above there was the sound of thunder. A hexagonal section of the invisible dome failed, and a pillar of black water of the same form crashed down, instantly turning the ruins below into dust. The dust did not move anymore, having lost its ability to turn back into magnificent buildings. The cursed wanderer halted for a moment, watching as his army was being destroyed. Then he lunged forward, broke through Slayer's defense with a reckless attack, and endured the sharp bite of her blades. He was severely wounded, but managed to push Slayer back with that sacrifice. She evaded the ghostly cutlass, but failed to evade his empty hand. The great wraith's hand pierced her abdomen, dealing her a deep wound, and threw her to the ground dozens of meters away. The cursed wanderer did not pursue his wounded opponent, though. He did not rush to join his melting army, either. Instead, the sinister apparition turned around and rushed toward the approaching ghastly mass of the flesh of Kanakhet. Sunny flinched. Curses. Chapter 27, '05 Soul of Kanakhet. Damnation. Behind Sunny, the palace collapsed inward with a deafening scream of ripping metal. Its proud spires and towering walls crumpled as if they were made from paper, and its foundation actually detached from the ground in a mess of jagged edges, slowly rising into the air. The entire huge structure seemed to levitate. In reality, of course, it wasn't taking flight. It was simply being drawn to a central point. The expanse of the palace above the void chamber was being drawn downward, while everything below it was being drawn upward. The unimaginable mass of metal was contracting under inconceivable pressure, deforming and losing shape as it slowly grew smaller. The invisible dome protecting the eternal was in the initial stages of collapsing, as well, and the flesh of Kanakhet was just a few steps away from reaching the shore of the palace island. But that was not what had Sunny's attention at the moment. Instead, it was the cursed wanderer, who had chosen to abandon his wraith army and dash toward the lumbering great titan instead of continuing his assault. That damn wretch. Belatedly, Sunny realized that just like he and his companions had already accomplished most of their goals, the sinister apparition had already accomplished his. Since they could simply retreat, so could he. It was just that nightmare creatures were not usually ones to resist the scent of human souls, so Sunny had not considered this turn of events seriously. But the cursed wanderer had already gotten his main praise, the remains of the heart of Kanakhet, which were preserved in Jet. Now that Jet was in his grasp, obliterating the Shadow Legion was merely a bonus. And it seemed like the great Wraith chose to continue expanding his collection of the fragments of Kanakhet first, then slaughter the humans second. Curse him. It was a reasonable choice. The problem was that Sunny could hardly pursue the apparition at the moment. Slayer was wounded and far behind the cursed wanderer, so even if she ignored her wounds and pursued, she would not be able to catch up with him in time. Saint was even further away, while Serpent and Fiend were entangled with a vast swarm of wraiths. Neither Neve nor the Shadow of Daron were swift enough, and even the puppeteer was not going to reach the sinister apparition in time. Sunny could only go himself, but if he did, the Shadow Legion would lose its hard-won advantage and fall into a dire state again. The flesh of Kanakhet was like a mountain now, having drawn close enough for its titanic body to be beheld in all its abhorrent glory. The boiling waters of the lake barely reached its knees, and as it took the next step, the entire palace island trembled. By now it could touch the shore by simply leaning down and outstretching a hand. And that was where the cursed wanderer was rushing, to the span of the lake shore directly in front of the great titan. He was raising his ethereal cutlass, as if prepared to sink it into the titan's flesh. His cold, sea-colored eyes were glowing with an ominous light. Sunny attempted to manifest shadows to bar the sinister apparition's path, but his adversary was too far, seconds away from reaching the shore. Crap! Sunny steeled himself for things going from bad to worse. But then something strange happened. The ethereal glow of the Viridian cutlass suddenly grew dimmer. And then it grew dimmer still. Come to think of it, Sunny suddenly realized that it had not emanated a wave of Viridian radiance, and therefore had not summoned a new swarm of wraiths in a while. The cursed wanderer had felt that something was wrong as well. Without ever slowing down, he spun and threw the ghostly cutlass, which cut through the raging currents of rain like a flash of Viridian lightning. The spinning blade soared high, aimed at the heart of the flesh of Kanakhet. Sunny did know what would have happened if the two parts of Kanakhet collided, and he never got the chance to find out. Because the ethereal cutlass never reached the titan. Almost immediately after it left its master's hand, a net of thin cracks spread across its Viridian blade. And then to Sunny's shock, and the cursed wanderer's shock as well, it shattered. Even the flesh of Kanakhet seemed stunned by the sudden destruction, halting for a moment as it reached the shallows of the lake. However, there was no mistake. The ghostly cutlass wielded by the sinister apparition broke apart as it flew, its shards falling down as they slowly dissolved into ethereal light. The soul of Kanakhet had been destroyed. Sunny perceived its destruction viscerally, sensing its faint but distressing shadow dissipate without a trace. How? He struggled to believe his own senses. The mist swirled as it swallowed the last glimmers of the eldritch horror. Then, the mist coalesced into a familiar form. Jet stood there in front of the cursed wanderer, wielding a fearsome scythe. She was still in her wraith form, looking dreadfully similar to undying Slaughter, by whose hand Sunny had died gruesomely many times. There was something different about her. Jet had not grown taller, but her presence had become far more overwhelming, making it seem like she did. It was as if she towered above the cursed wanderer now, looking down at him with her icy blue eyes. The cursed wanderer glanced at her as well. Then the harrowing scythe fell down, passing through his ghostly body from shoulder to hip. He remained motionless for a few seconds, frozen in place. But a moment later, a gust of dreadful wind blew and dispelled him like mist. Just like that, the cursed wanderer was destroyed as well. He was vanquished in the very heart of the eternal city, which he had searched for thousands of years, slain by a far more harrowing wraith. Jet lowered her scythe and glanced up, as if wanting to inhale deeply. At that moment, Cassie's voice resounded in Sunny's head. "See, I told you she'll be fine." Chapter 27, 06 Fox in the Henhouse. You have slain a great tyrant, soul of Kanakhet. You have slain a corrupted devil, elites of the Nine. Jet glanced up at the dark sky of the eternal city. She should have felt ecstatic, but instead, the thought that came to mind was, damn. She had not been away for long, but the sky above her was crumbling. The torrential rain had turned into an apocalyptic downpour, and here and there, colossal hexagonal pillars towered above the ruined city. From afar, it seemed as if they were supporting the invisible dome of the sky, but it did not take Jet more than a moment to realize what they really were. The vast surface of the invisible dome turned out to be composed of countless hexagons, and as some of them faded out of existence, the cold waters of the storm sea rushed down under devastating pressure. The giant pillars were not supporting the dome. They were water falling through the breaches in the dome, still contained in their shape. On top of that, the palace was nowhere to be seen. Instead of it, a gargantuan mass of bent metal was floating in the air, groaning as it was being bent even further. By the dead gods, I only stepped out for a moment. On the positive side, the Shadow Legions seemed to have been pushing the wraiths back. And now that both the tyrant controlling them and the devil controlling the tyrant were gone, those wraiths were barely a threat. They would be wiped out before too long. Right. Jet finally remembered what she had done. She had killed them. The soul of Kanak, the cursed wanderer. The horror of the seas, Dutchman, and its fearsome captain were both gone, slain by her hand like many abominations before them. Jet had killed countless nightmare creatures throughout the years, but still, this was her crowning achievement. A saint killing a great tyrant was not exactly a common occurrence. In fact, it was something that was not really supposed to happen. And yet, Jet had done it. In the end, it had all come down to the decision she made, after activating the special ability granted to the Mist Blade by the soul of the heart of Kanakhet. Jet had wanted to attempt killing the cursed wanderer, but she was not sure if she would be able to. It was a gamble, and a perilous one at that. So in the end, she went with a different gamble. Instead of trying to slay the master of the soul of Kanakhet, he chose to be swallowed by it. It was not an entirely reckless decision. Jet had been studying the Dutchman and its wraiths for a while by then. She had especially noted that the ghostly cutlass kept emanating torrents of ethereal light, summoning more spectral warriors onto the battlefield, which meant that its hold was not empty yet. The soul of Kanakhet was a hungry beast that had devoured countless souls throughout the ages. However, Jet had quite an appetite herself. She wanted to kill the cursed wanderer, but that was not her task. Her task was to hold him back and buy her allies enough time to accomplish their goals. The soul of Kanakhet was his source of power, so if she could destroy or weaken it, that would achieve the same result. Plus, she had just the needed constitution to do that, being a wraith and all. So instead of trying to kill the cursed wanderer in the single heartbeat granted to her by the heart of Kanakhet, Jet severed his hand and took hold of the ghostly cutlass instead. She knew that it would consume her. In fact, the very purpose of stealing the soul of Kanakhet was to be consumed by it. Still, when she felt herself being drawn into the Viridian blade, she could not help but feel unnerved and cursed quietly. In the next moment she was gone. Out there in the belly of the soul of Kanakhet, the world was different. There was no world there, actually, to begin with. There was no space, no time, no life, no death. Just a vague expanse of Viridian glow that enveloped her like a mire. And the presence of many souls that the tyrant had consumed, just like her. But there was one crucial difference between Jet and those subjugated souls. They had been killed before becoming thralls of the soul of Kanakhet. Jet, however, had been dead to begin with. She entered captivity as a malevolent wraith, not as a hapless soul stripped of its flesh. And that allowed Jet a measure of independence, at least for a brief moment. She was on the verge of dying by then, her soul almost entirely drained of essence. The tyrannical will of the soul of Kanakhet descended upon her, striving to suffocate her sense of self and make her a mindless, obedient thrall. It might have succeeded, as well, it would have, probably, given a chance. But Jet did not give the soul of Kanakhet an opportunity to conquer her. Instead, she used that brief moment to raise the mist blade and focused her killing intent into a razor-sharp scythe. One slash of that scythe was enough to harvest every enthralled soul within the great tyrant. After all, there was no space and no time there. That meant that all of the captured souls occupied the same space, and unleashing 10,000 strikes took the same amount of time as striking on. See? So, like a fox in the henhouse, Soul Reaper Jet slaughtered every single phantom contained within the soul of Kanakhet in an instant. Oh. A tsunami of essence flooded her crumbling soul, mending it in an instant. Much more impactful was the great torrent of fragments that flowed into her shattered soul core. The core, which had been growing steadily for decades, suddenly ballooned, increasing in size at a speed visible to the naked eye. It had instantly grown so vast, and so heavy, in fact, that Jet's transcendent soul started to struggle with bearing its weight. That's quite a boon, I think. Jet felt strange, much more powerful, yes, but also dangerously unbalanced. She would deal with that later, though, for now. Jet had slaughtered every soul enveloped by the Viridian glow with her first strike. Her second strike was aimed at the walls of her prison itself. It was as if she were cutting a way through the belly of a beast after being swallowed by it. Soon enough, the strange unworld surrounding her shattered, and she found herself under the tempestuous sky of the Eternal City once again. Standing in front of the cursed wanderer, the sinister wraith seemed greatly diminished now that the source of his power was destroyed. Jet, meanwhile, felt more powerful than ever. So she brought her scythe down and erased her adversary from existence. That was how the dreadful legend of the cursed wanderer and his appalling ship ended. That was how a new chapter was added to the glorious legend of the Soul Reaper Jet, as well. Chapter 27:07 Finish Line. The battle against the Dutchman and his Wraith Armada was all but over. It ended suddenly and without warning when Jet shattered the soul of Kanakhet from within and cut its master down with her mist blade. At the moment, surrounded by cold mist in her ghostly form, she really did look like the Grim Reaper. Continuing to pour all of his will into stitching Nightwalker and his shadow back together, Sunny whistled quietly. She really is fine. Honestly, it felt great. For once, someone else had pulled off an unexpected and utterly unbelievable, borderline preposterous feat. Sunny was quite happy to be usurped. This peculiar mixture of disbelief and elation, is that how people feel when I'm around? Maybe it was. What are you mumbling about? Sunny was pale and covered in cold sweat because of his ghastly burns and the exertion of bending the world to his will, while Nightwalker looked the same because his soul was being pierced by a literal needle. His voice sounded a bit strained. Sunny flashed him a brief smile. It's Jet, she killed the Dutchman. Nightwalker blinked a few times. That lovely young lady, she destroyed that fiend. Sunny chuckled. Yes, to everyone outside the Eternal City, that lovely young lady is the fiend. She had once been the commanding officer of the Devil, after all. Sunny sounded nonchalant, but while he wasn't as stunned as Nightwalker, he was also surprised. Jet was strong, yes, but the most powerful adversary she had defeated before was a great devil, and even then, Effie and Kai had aided her. So he had not expected her to go and outright slay the Dutchman. She had given them an unexpected gift. There were countless wraiths still left on the battlefield, but now that the tyrant who commanded them was gone, they became a disorganized mob. The Shadow Legion had already been gaining the upper hand, so now the battle was turning into a slaughter. The sorcery of the Demon of Repose was failing, and as more holes appeared on the surface of the dome, the ruins below were not repairing themselves anymore. The crushing had destroyed the Eternal City one final time. Behind Sunny, the palace was slowly turning into an enormous sphere of jagged scrap metal. Beyond the palace, oh damn! The entire eastern expanse of the lake was enveloped in white flames and swirling torrents of black dust. Nephi seemed to have unleashed her true transcendent form, becoming a boundless sea of immolating fire. The maelstrom of flame and dust was revolving furiously, being drawn to the epicenter of the fiery calamity. Soon, it coalesced into a radiant silhouette that hovered alone above the water, illuminating the darkness with her luminosity. Nephi seemed to have absorbed the madness of Kanakhet into herself. That was one way to deal with the seemingly indestructible nightmare creature. Just her style. She remained motionless for a few moments, then lowered her head slowly and briefly covered her eyes with an unsteady hand. Then her eyes ignited with a pristine, ferocious white light. Sunny thought that he heard an echo of an inhuman wail. I guess that one is dead as well. Ah, I suddenly feel lazy. Sunny was not entirely sure how Nephis had managed to absorb the madness of Kanakhet into her mind and burn it to ashes instead of succumbing to it. But then again, that sounded exactly like something she would do. If it had been Sunny, he would have probably had to suffer infuriating whispers for a couple of years before finding a way to rid himself of the maddening mind invader. What are you talking about now? Nightwalker glanced at him with curiosity. Sunny smiled. Oh, Nephis killed the madness of Kanakhet. Nightwalker tilted his head. Nephis, that pretty young lady. Sunny gave him a smoldering glare. Yes, and hey, bastard, pretty young lady again? Don't you know any other words? Nightwalker smiled sheepishly. What? I'm just saying it like it is. He paused for a moment, then asked with a hint of excitement in his voice. What about Neve? Whom did he kill? Sunny stared at him with a dubious expression. A bunch of wraiths. Nightwalker remained silent for a bit, then glanced away and sighed. Well, he did his best. Sunny frowned and drove Weaver's needle into his soul. Ouch. At that moment, Sunny dismissed the shadow lantern. The last of the shadows had just entered the Gate of Shadow, so there was no need to keep it manifested anymore. Sunny had recruited as many as he could, and the rest were already being obliterated by the Shadow Realm. A resulting essence storm was becoming increasingly devastating and ferocious, accelerating their final demise. Even Sunny's own avatars were not safe there anymore. So raising a hand, he summoned the Shadow Lantern back. The small stone lantern appeared in his hand as if nothing had happened, as if it had not randomly turned into a black hole and obliterated both the divine sorcery of the Demon of Repose and her entire palace. Its gate opened, and 3 tattered shadows flowed out of it, turning into 3 battered avatars of Sunny. Welcome back, guys. Good job. Behind them, the messy sphere of metal that had been levitating high above the island suddenly plummeted down and hit the ground with a deafening thunderclap. It was all that remained of the palace, 100 times smaller in diameter, but weighing the same. The moment the sphere impacted against the ground, the palace island shook and its surface split open. Shielding his eyes from the cloud of dust and debris that rose into the air, Sunny calmly continued stitching. Nightwalker, meanwhile, glanced north, where a titanic mountain of ghastly flesh was drawing closer to the shore. The arrival of the flesh of Kanakhet was imminent, and the shadow was attached only halfway. So only this ugly thing is left, then. Sunny took a deep breath. Yeah, why worry, though? It's just a great titan. Chapter 27, 08 Enemy Titan. Sunny would be a fool not to be wary of a great titan, especially one as ominous as the flesh of Kanakhet. True, he had slain a cursed tyrant once, a being who was far more powerful, at least in theory. However, that had happened inside Ariel's game, where the puppeteer had been heavily restricted by the rules of the miniature realm. Its greatest power was the beings it controlled, but in the end, the sinister moth had been forced to face Sunny alone in melee combat. So now its shadow helped him control his legion. The flesh of Kanakit was not restricted by anything, though, and could unleash its power fully. Still, while Sonny was worried, he wasn't too worried. Facing the great titan alone might have been tough, but at the moment there were two supreme titans set against it, the Lord of Shadows and the Star of Ruin. Speaking of ruin, Nephis had thoroughly destroyed the Eternal City with the help of the Crushing. Sonny had unraveled the sorcery sustaining it, while she obliterated the city itself. Now it was slowly being turned to dust by the growing number of hexagonal pillars of water, and only the area around the palace island still remained unscathed. Well, relatively unscathed. The palace itself was gone, and the entire island had cracked. The Shadow Legion was still cleaning up the remaining wraiths, exacerbating the damage. What wondrous destruction! The Eternal City had survived thousands of years, but Sonny and Nephis wrecked it in the span of a day. Now all they had to do was destroy the flesh of Kanakit, as well, or at least stall it long enough for him to make Nightwalker mortal again. Sonny considered his options carefully while his avatars moved to the northern shore of the island. He abandoned the puppeteer, as well, judging that the Shadow Legion could finish the job even without his direct participation. So, 4 of his avatars stepped out of the shadows near Jet. She was still in her wraith form, looking calmly at the looming titan. Letting his avatars fuse into one, Sonny spent a second enjoying the rush of power and raised an eyebrow. "Why are you not turning back into a human?" Her ghostly eyes pierced him with a distant gaze. Jet remained silent for a while, then shrugged. Oh, somehow this felt more natural for a moment. The mist around them flowed, being absorbed into her ethereal form and her scythe. Then she turned back into a human and forced out a smile. Damn, I look like a corpse. Her armor was torn and her face was bloodied. Having endured the duel against the cursed Wanderer, Jet looked quite battered, although, surprisingly, not as battered as Slayer was. That was the difference between fighting an enemy that you perfectly countered and one that you did not. Sonny stared at her for a moment, then said neutrally, "You are a corpse." Jet grinned. "At least I have a corpse, though. You're just a creepy shadow." Sonny could not help but smile back. "Excuse me, creepy. I'm not just a creepy shadow. I'm also 6 other shadows." He fell silent for a few seconds, then added earnestly, "Also, good job killing the Dutchman." Jet nodded. "Good job destroying the palace. You should think about opening a demolition company." With that, she turned and looked back at the flesh of Kanakit. She remained silent for a moment, then asked, "So what now? I sort of gained a lot from slaying that dreadful duo. Essence, a deluge of fragments, and their souls are trapped in the mist blade now as well. However, as much as I hate to admit it, I don't think I am ready to fight another damn part of Kanakit." Sonny shook his head. "That's all right. You should head back and help Cassie and Neve finish off the remnants of the Wraith Armada. We'll take it from here." He paused to think for a second, and then added, "Oh, and since this whole place seems to be falling apart, be ready to board the chain breaker and get the hell out of here. Great Titan be damned." Jet chuckled. "I guess our expedition is really coming to an end then." She looked at the scene of devastation around them, then sighed and turned her back to the lake. "It was fun, but also, let's do something less exciting next time." Sonny wasn't sure that he could promise something like that in good faith, but still nodded. "Deal. Actually, I've been thinking about exploring the underworld." But Jet was already rushing away. "Nope, not a chance. Take Cassie instead. She hasn't had an astonishing adventure with the Lord of Shadows yet." With that, she was gone. However, Sonny was not alone on the fractured shore. At some point during their conversation, Nephis had landed on the stones behind them, her silver hair moving faintly in the wind. Now she walked over to stand beside Sonny on the edge of the water, and both of them looked at the approaching Titan. "Why did she run away? What did you say?" Sonny coughed. "I just shared my plans, you know, one last expedition." She remained silent for a moment. "I see." Her voice should have been flat and devoid of emotion somewhat, but it sounded strangely full of it instead. Sonny studied her carefully, feeling that something about his girlfriend had changed. "The madness of Kanakit, I assume it's dead." Nephis shrugged slightly. "It's dying, having it in my head. was fruitful. I think I took a big step toward mastering the knowledge of corruption. Sunny smiled faintly. That's good. He fell silent, then asked in the same tone. So, how are we going to handle this great titan? Nephi's looked up at the immense expanse of the walking, abhorrent mountain of grotesque flesh, and said with a hint of hesitation in her voice, I go high, you go low. Sunny studied her for a moment. Was that a comment about my height? Nephi's finally turned away from the titan and looked at him silently. I love your height. Sunny coughed again. Oh, that's good then. As Nephi's took a step forward, though, his expression changed subtly. Wait, hey, you didn't say no. Chapter 27:09 in the flesh. Neph's skin swelled with a blinding radiance, and two gorgeous wings opened behind her. She soared into the crumbling sky of the eternal city, rising to meet the titanic figure of the abhorrent great titan. It was as if a falling star was shooting from the ground to pierce its gigantic head, surrounded by a vast halo of pure light. Light and darkness clashed, and darkness parted to make way. Illuminated by the passing of the star of ruin, countless raindrops glistened like precious jewels. At the same time, a tide of shadows swallowed Sunny and surged, transforming into the Shadow Colossus. Jade Mantle encased him in a suit of fearsome black armor. He summoned Serpent, who turned into a tenebrous Odachi that spanned no less than 200 meters. Dare I say that my height is of no issue? Sunny smiled. His shell was truly enormous, but it seemed tiny in front of the monstrous figure of the flesh of Kanakhat, barely reaching its knee. He could make it taller, but the amount of effort needed to maintain such an immense manifestation would grow exponentially, especially considering how intricate a proper shell needed to be. So while this size was not his limit, it was the optimal choice. Let's fight a titan. Sunny took a step forward. RD. At the same time, he activated the weakening curse, enchantment of the curse, with 4 links of his shadow-bound memory working in tandem to rob the flesh of Kanakhat of its strength. The effect was both potent and instant, making the great titan stagger a little as it rose from the lake. Nephi's had almost reached it by then. However, instead of attacking straight away, she circled the titanic nightmare creature, as if aiming to attack it from behind. Although titans were enormous, they were also relatively slow, or at least were supposed to be due to their unimaginable size. Nephi's, on the contrary, was impossibly fast, so trying to circle the foe seemed like a good tactic. However, in reality, the flesh of Kanak did not seem to care about where the attack came from. Its misshapen figure resembled a human, but did not behave like a human. As soon as Neph's drew close to the back of its head, countless tendrils of bleeding flesh shot from its shoulders like a slithering forest, threatening to pierce, envelop, and suffocate her. But that was all right. Delivering a powerful blow was not the main purpose of her maneuver. Anyway, the real purpose was simply to get behind the flesh of Kanakhat. Because now that Nephi's was behind it, her blinding radiance cast the Titan's shadow onto the palace island. And there, Sunny reversed the grip on the hilt of his lethal Odachi, then plunged it into that shadow to the hilt. At the same time, the name of Kanak thundered from the crumbling sky as Nephi's called fire and destruction upon the great Titan. Flying back from the forest of red tendrils, she brandished the blessing and unleashed an enormous plume of flame from its blade. It was as if her sword suddenly extended to be hundreds of meters long, cutting cleanly through the creature's neck. The flesh of Kanak had been weakened. Then Nephi's and Sunny delivered simultaneous blows. Sunny targeted its soul, while Nephi's targeted its corporeal vessel. The great Titan shuddered. Its head started to fall, a charred chasm opening across its vast neck. However, a moment later, countless ropes of flesh shot from the awful wound, breaching the chasm. They connected the head back to the neck, then tensed, pulling the severed parts back together. A moment later, the ghastly cut disappeared entirely, as if it had never existed at all. The soul of the ghastly nightmare creature did not seem severely damaged, either, or possibly it had repaired itself in the blink of an eye, just like the body did. Sunny grimaced. This is going to be bad. A heartbeat later, the flesh of Kanakhat retaliated. Moving with surprising speed, it leaned forward and slammed its ghastly fist into the ground, only missing Sunny by a hair's breadth due to his rapid reaction. The entire island shuddered, the fractures scarring its surface growing wider. At the same time, two more immense arms suddenly shot from its back in a torrent of blood, aiming to catch Nephi's. The lake receded, then rushed back in a towering wave. That was... Sonny was no more than 100 meters away from the arm of the great Titan, the enormous fist resting in a small crater, well within the striking distance of his Odachi. He was already in the proper stance as well, so it would take him only a heartbeat to unleash a devastating slash. Close. However, before Sonny could pat himself on the shoulder for skirting the obliterating blow, the flesh of the immense forearm squirmed, and countless tendrils shot from it toward him. This time, there was no time to evade them. High above, Nephi's had become a radiant spirit. A powerful explosion rippled from his shining figure, tearing the two hands closing in on her to shreds. But instead of being destroyed, new hands grew from the bleeding stumps, reaching toward her again. At the same time, Sonny was enveloped by the red tendrils. They slithered across his armor, penetrating the seams between its parts. Two pierced the visor of his helmet, burrowing into the eyes of the Shadow Colossus shell. The damage they dealt was not really severe. But something eerie happened then. The flesh of the great Titan did not simply stop at damaging the shell. Instead, it grew, spreading through the shell like countless tumors. The shell, built in the image of a human body, became infected, compromised, and then transformed by the invading sickness. Damnation! Sonny barely had time to escape his own shell. Appearing out of the shadows hundreds of meters away, he threw a stunned look at the towering Shadow Colossus. If it could be called that still. Enveloped and penetrated by the bleeding flesh, it looked no different from the titanic nightmare creature behind it. It had been infected by the flesh of Kanakhet. It had become the flesh of Kanakhet. The red colossus shuddered, then took a step forward. Then another. Then it collided with the forearm of the great Titan and was absorbed into it, becoming a part of the ghastly creature. Standing on the shattered ground of the palace island, Sonny shivered. I can't feel those shadows anymore. Only Serpent managed to escape, assuming his soul beast form and slithering away. Sonny's shell was truly and utterly gone. Chapter 27, 10 Growing Threat. Even weakened, the flesh of Kanak was fearsome. It was enormous. Its power was like a natural calamity. Its vitality seemed boundless, and its will was like a vast ocean, reshaping the world around the great Titan to excuse its existence. Worse than that, its grotesque body was infinitely malleable, mutating at a startling speed to answer the demands of combat. That made the monstrous nightmare creature utterly unpredictable, and therefore countless times more perilous. But worst of all was the fact that the flesh of Kanak could grow. It infected any living being, or a semblance of a living being, it could reach, then made them a part of itself. I can't let it touch me. After witnessing the fate of his shell, Sonny felt quite disturbed. He was not at all confident that his body would be able to resist the flesh of Kanakhet, even if it had been altered by Weaver's lineage. And since it seemed that even manifested shadows could become hosts to the parasitic Titan, at least if the form they were manifested into resembled living beings, he could not be sure that abandoning human flesh in favor of his natural form would be of any use either. How do I kill something that I cannot touch? For now, Sonny chose to continue with his original strategy and attack the shadow of the great Titan instead of targeting its body, aiming to destroy the nightmare creature's soul. Nephi's and Sonny clashed with the flesh of Kanakhet, causing the entire world to ripple and quake. The fury of the forces they unleashed was so terrifying that the palace island started crumbling into the water, while the water itself boiled and seethed in a turbulent chaos of towering waves. The echoes of their terrifying battle washed over the wraiths and the shadows, forcing many to halt. They even reached the ivory island, making its chains rattle and the trees growing on its heavenly surface sway. Nephi's unleashed torrents of incinerating flame and rays of annihilating light, burning and severing the body of the great Titan. Sonny continued to pursue its shadow, delivering one strike after another. They worked together naturally and seamlessly without the need to use any words. Not that it did them any good. Cohesion and cooperation were vital in battle, but when the enemy could mutate in any kind of way at any given moment, there were no vulnerabilities left for them to help each other exploit. No matter the timing of their attacks or the direction, the flesh of Kanakhet could always respond to them with dreadful effectiveness. And even if they did manage to deliver it grievous wounds, those wounds were simply mended without leaving any trace behind. The great Titan itself, meanwhile, was overwhelmingly powerful, and every one of its terrifying attacks threatened to destroy them. Well, maybe not. Sonny had 7 incarnations after all, so he would lose a few parts of himself at best if one of the attacks landed. Nephi's, meanwhile, could heal herself endlessly. Neither of them even knew if it was possible to kill her, let alone if the flesh of Kanakhat could. But despite their tenacity, they were at a disadvantage in this battle, because unlike the great Titan, they had something to protect. They needed to protect the Ivory Island, as well as their companions, Jet, Cassie, and Neve. Most of all, Sonny needed to keep the flesh of Kanakhat away from his last incarnation and Nightwalker, since the process of reuniting his shadow with him could not be interrupted. So they pushed the great Titan back into the lake and continued the fight in the shallows. It was then that Nephi's finally failed to dodge an attack. The tendrils growing from the immense body of the flesh of Kanakhat had caught her as she was preparing to unleash a conflagration of soul flame. She was a spirit made of light, at the moment, a being made entirely from flame, which made it so there was no flesh for the Titan to infect. However, the tide of red flesh enveloped her still. And then something truly disturbing happened. There was no body for the flesh of Kanakhat to infect and control, so it created a body. The tendrils of flesh enveloping Nephi's slowly assumed a twisted, deformed semblance of her own figure around the radiant spirit, imprisoning her within a cage of bleeding flesh. It was not a mere physical barrier either. When the flesh of Kanakhat grew a body for Nephi's, that revolting shell actually became her body. And since she possessed a body now, the Titan could infect her. Another terrifying explosion shook the world, and Nephi's escaped the body that was forced upon her mind and soul in a whirlwind of flame. She seemed a bit disturbed. "Eds, though, nothing is working." Cassie relayed their messages, allowing them to speak with each other. "Physical attacks have no effect. It is too big to be turned to ash, and any burns I leave on its body disappear without a trace. Its soul is unimaginably resilient as well." That was what it felt like to fight a Titan. That being, it seemed endless, inexhaustible, impossible to destroy. Sonny was starting to feel a bit of apprehension. So what the hell do we do? They could even stall for time, really, because the flesh of Kanakhat was too powerful. Even death was having no effect. Nephi's remained silent for a few seconds before relaying the rest of her message to Cassie. "I am not sure. We need to keep attacking it, gather information, and then come up with something that will work." If there was something that could work, Sonny gritted his teeth. If only. And at that moment, a familiar voice suddenly resounded in his ears. It was a familiar voice, of course it was. After all, it belonged to Sonny himself. It was the voice of the handy bracelet. It said, "Your shadow has evolved." Chapter 27, 11 Nightmare Fuel. It took Sonny a moment to realize what he had heard. "My shadow, what?" The flesh of Kanakhat went on the offensive just then, surging forward in an avalanche of bleeding tendrils, gargantuan limbs, and titanic power. An obliterating explosion bloomed in its path, sending a devastating shockwave spreading outward in all directions. The waters of the lake seethed, and Sonny leaned into the forceful blow, feeling his bones rattle as he withstood it. If there were any intact buildings left in the Eternal City, they would have been toppled by the shockwave. Even the dark castle shook, a few cracks appearing on its walls, but the great Titan was not even slowed. A conflagration of white flames charred its enormous body, turning a vast swath of it into a ghastly blackened mass. Entire slabs of tissue vanished, as if the fire had taken bites out of the gargantuan abomination. A few moments later, however, the flesh of Kanakhat mended its burned body and continued barreling toward the palace island. Sonny gritted his teeth, manifesting countless chains to hold it back. The chains snapped. Which of my shadows evolved? That was a stupid question, really. There were thousands of subdued immortals sleeping within the dark castle, trapped in the labyrinth of nightmares. Those immortals were bizarre beings. Their minds and identity were gone, but their bodies and souls were still intact, endlessly revived by the Eternal City. At the same time, there were parasitic pieces of the flesh of Kanakhat inside their bodies, controlling them. The flesh of Kanakhat was not the only thing infecting the immortals, though. They were also infected by the dream curse. Or rather, had been. The immortals had been caught in the maze of dreams by Nightmare, and every being that died within that maze made the tenebrous steed stronger, their souls serving as fuel in the furnace of his ascension. Nightmare had been fighting an uphill battle before because his victims could not die. However, once Sunny opened the gate of shadow and made them mortal again, things changed. The immortals perished, and suddenly thousands of ancient and exceedingly powerful souls became nourishment for his loyal steed. And that pushed Nightmare across the threshold of evolving to a new rank. Nightmare was a supreme terror now. Drowned by the shadow of the flesh of Kanakhet, Sunny smiled wickedly. Just in time. Nightmare. Answering his call, a vast and dreadful presence revealed itself in the shadows. A chilling wind blew across the devastated island, and the scattered wraiths shivered, suddenly overcome by fear. Then 2 terrifying crimson flames ignited in the darkness, and the shadows slowly formed into the shape of a black, monstrous steed. The radiance of the dying flames reflected from the adamantine surface of Nightmare's steel horns and fangs, his hooves turning the stone rubble to dust. With his mane dancing in the wind, Nightmare galloped across the fractured ground, bringing terror and dread with him. Reaching Sunny, he stopped and cast a chilling gaze at him, cold fury burning in his ominous crimson eyes. Sunny could not help but smile. "Good job, buddy." Then he pointed at the gargantuan form of the flesh of Kanakhet. "Go put that thing to sleep." Nightmare stared at him for a few moments, then turned to look at the great titan and neighed. The sound of the appalling stallion's voice echoed above the boiling lake like a dreadful lullaby, and he rushed forward in a torrent of harrowing darkness. Sunny looked at the colossal abomination, too. Suddenly, it did not seem so enormous anymore. Well, naturally it didn't. The notion of a great titan was daunting and calamitous. However, when 2 supreme titans and a supreme terror opposed it, it lost some of its dree. At full implication. "Let's go." Not wishing to let his steed outpace him, Sunny lunged forward. The flesh Kanakhet was vast. Its body, its soul, its will were like boundless oceans, seemingly endless and inexhaustible. So even if Nightmare was supreme now, it was going to take some time to lull the titanic abomination into slumber. But not as much time as it would have taken normally. After all, the great titan was weakened by 4 fully augmented links of the curse. All its resistances were compromised by a sinister poison, and it was made vulnerable to the insidious infection of the dream curse. The titan was going to fall asleep much faster than it was supposed to, and even before that, it would slowly grow drowsy, compounding the advantage Sunny and Nephi's had. Somewhere behind them, Slayer and Jet fought side by side, eradicating the frenzied wraiths. Saint and Fiend led the Shadow Legion to do the same. Neve followed the shadow of Daron, observing how the ancient sovereign fought with focused intensity. The dark castle trembled slightly. This little. It seemed that the marvelous mimic was sneakily devouring the bodies of the perished immortals, while its master was looking away. Sunny was a bit concerned, but he decided to deal with the gluttonous shadow later. For now he had a great titan to fight. Emerging from the cloud of immolating flames like a bleeding mountain, the flesh of Kanakhet finally stepped onto the soil of the palace island. Its red mass instantly seemed to take root in it, numerous tendrils shooting from its feet and shins into the ground. Then the flesh began to spread, slowly devouring the island. The blessing flashed, severing one of the great titan's knees. Another explosion detonated within the cut, obliterating the entire joint. It repaired itself, of course, but not before the flesh of Kanakhet lost balance and fell to its knees, supporting its inconceivable weight with both forearms. Sunny was not celebrating, though, because both forearms of the great titan took root, too, accelerating the rate with which the red mass of ghastly flesh spread south from the northern shore. Damnation! Taken aback a little, he watched as the palace island was being slowly consumed by an ocean of bleeding flesh. The ghastly mass continued to grow and spread without ever slowing down or showing any sign of stopping. At the source of it, the flesh of Kanakhet had lost all resemblance to a human, looking more like an abominable four-legged beast. Sunny grimaced, nonplussed. Well, that's just great. Chapter 27, 12-3 Titans. The flesh of Kanak was like a force of nature, unstoppable and seemingly inevitable. Its ghastly body was like a mountain, a furious mountain that was full of frenzied malevolence and hunger, overcome by an insatiable greed to assimilate all living beings into its grotesque expanse. At the same time, it mended and restored itself no matter what grievous wounds were dealt to it, indifferently shrugging off attacks that would have destroyed entire cities, if not continents. The gigantic vessel of the great Titan was only half a problem, too. There was also the undulating, revolting mass of red flesh that expanded outward from where it stood on the fractured shore, slowly consuming the palace island as it grew. Sonny hated to admit it, but he was honestly at a loss. How were they supposed to stop that boundless horror? He sifted through his memory, trying to remember if he had ever battled a similar nightmare creature. There had been some that were immense, and there had been some that were like elemental forces. There had even been some that boasted inexhaustible vitality. But Sonny had never faced an adversary quite like this one. The closest match he could think of was a nightmare creature he knew of, but had not witnessed himself, a Lethier of the Nine, the first Seeker. That fiend had even corrupted everything it touched, just like the flesh of Kanak infected and assimilated everyone that touched it. Nephi's, how exactly did you defeat the first Seeker? Having failed to keep the great Titan away from the island, Nephi's streaked across the sky and landed gracefully nearby, sliding back on wet stone before coming to a halt just a few meters away from Sonny. Her voice sounded a little concerned when she spoke. That thing, well, I blew up the city. She raised the blessing, preparing to resume her relentless assault on the distressing Titan. That didn't kill her, though, so I blew up the city some more, and after that I burned all that remained. She had already unleashed the wrath of her flames upon the flesh of Kanak, and it did not help, even though the power she wielded now was incomparably greater than it had been in the tomb of Ariel. Still, the answer was typical. No, really. How did a woman whose go-to strategy was, if you can attack something up, why bother coming up with anything else? Become the ruler of humanity. Oh, right, it was because Sonny, Cassie, and Nephi's had schemed and plotted for years to put her on the throne. And also because blowing things up was an effective strategy in a surprising number of situations. But sadly, not this situation. Sonny gritted his teeth. That doesn't seem to be working, though. Nephi's glanced at the towering figure of the flesh of Kanak calmly, then nodded. And that is not our only problem, either. She looked past the great Titan. Out there, the eternal city was slowly coming undone. The invisible dome that had protected it for thousands of years was unraveling, and the black depths of the storm sea were rushing into the breaches, eager to reclaim their prize. The edges of the vast ruin had already been crushed and consumed by water, which stood like a dark wall in the distance. Closer to the palace island, hexagonal pillars stood here and there, with new ones appearing every few seconds. Some of the islands were completely destroyed, some had been fractured or pierced. The wharf had been obliterated. The lighthouse still stood somehow, even if it had been submerged in water. Just then, another pillar descended from the broken dome, devastating the clock tower, this time forever. The final devastation was slowly converging on the heart of the eternal city, which meant that they did not have a lot of time left, even if the flesh of Kanak did not swallow them soon. Nephi spared Sonny a brief look. How much longer do you need? Her tone was even, but he could tell that she was eager to reclaim Nightwalker for the benefit of humanity, too. After all, the fate of humanity was not only her direct, but also personal responsibility. Sonny grimaced. A bit longer. Nephi's lingered for a split second, then nodded. Then we hold that thing back for as long as we must. With that, she ignited her soul, burning through it to unleash a blinding white inferno. The names escaped from her lips, shaping the world according to her will. This time it was Sonny who manifested a pair of black wings and soared into the air. The sky was crumbling upon the ruins of the eternal city, and in its heart, a grotesque red infection was spreading like a vast tumor. It felt like the world was coming to an end. Let's make it a happy end, then. A towering wall of white flames rose across the northern reaches of the palace island, cutting off the advance of the spreading mass of flesh. The avalanche of bleeding tissue fell into the fire and burned, turning. G to ash, then grew again and burned again, disappearing into the immolating crucible. The fractured ground turned incandescent and then melted, becoming a sea of lava. It flowed into the lake, producing billowing clouds of searing steam. High above, Sunny opened the gate of shadow once again and summoned the ancient darkness of the realm of death into his hand. He manifested it into a long javelin, making it as heavy as he could, heavy enough that even his supreme strength was barely enough to hold it. Then, he raised his hand and threw the javelin down with all his might. No tricks, no clever enchantments. Just inconceivable weight and pure kinetic force. The black javelin fell like a dark meteor and pierced the shoulder of the great Titan, impacting it with so much force that the huge nightmare creature staggered and was pushed to the ground. Its shoulder joint exploded, erased from existence, and one of its limbs was separated from the great mass of slithering flesh. The entire island quaked, a vast swath of it sliding into the boiling lake. Countless tendrils of flesh shot from the torn limb, reconnecting it to the main body. But before it was fully attached, Sunny had already summoned another javelin. I just need to buy us time. The battle raged as more and more of the Eternal City disappeared under the water. Chapter 27, 13 Elemental Forces. In the end, the flesh of Kanak never reached the Dark Castle. It grew and spread until the entire northern part of the Palace Island became consumed by the virulent mass of red flesh. Sunny could easily imagine that harrowing Red Sea expanding endlessly, swallowing entire cities, kingdoms, and realms, metastasizing until the entire world and all the living creatures inhabiting it became nothing but one endless, dreadful expanse of undulating flesh. A single, abhorrent organism. But that was not meant to be, because a towering wall of immolating white flame ignited in the great Titan's path like a sacred barrier. No matter how much the harrowing mass of bleeding flesh grew, no matter how hungrily it reached forward, its tendrils were burned and incinerated, becoming nothing but ash. It was a primal, elemental conflict between two titans of an equal rank. Nephi stood motionlessly behind the wall of fire, looking forward with a dispassionate expression on her beautiful face. Her calm gray eyes were cold and firm, shining with the pure white radiance of incandescent flame, and the scathing, dreadful agony of being burned alive. Behind the emotionless mask, however, a storm of furious passions fueled her fire. The sea of red flesh could not pass the wall of white flames, but the flames could not spread and consume the Red Sea either. The two titanic forces were at a stalemate. Meanwhile, the main vessel of the great Titan, a hideous, bestial colossus of bleeding flesh, was struggling to advance deeper inland. Its attempts were thwarted by Sunny, who unleashed a hail of devastating javelins from the dark expanse of the crumbling sky, all aimed at the joints and tendons of the detestable creature. Each javelin struck like a meteor, causing the boiling waters of the vast lake to overflow its banks and making the sprawling ruins of the Eternal City quake violently. His aim was true, striking the flesh of Kanak in the precise points that, if damaged, would slow the Titan down the most. In retaliation, the gargantuan nightmare creature unleashed a vile forest of towering tendrils to pursue Sunny across the sky, forcing him to play a fatal game of cat and mouse across the collapsing firmament. The battle of three titans was truly terrifying, unfolding like a world-ending calamity in the heart of the dying city. No, actually, isn't it the battle of four titans? Serpent participated too. And naturally, there was Nightmare as well. The battle had gone badly for Sunny and Nephi's at first. They had barely managed to hold ground, gritting their teeth and refusing to be pushed back. He was even forced to consider the worst-case scenario, abandoning Nightwalker and retreating to save themselves. But then, slowly, the dream curse started to take hold. It was difficult to notice at first, the effects barely noticeable. But as Sunny and Nephi stubbornly continued to resist the flesh of Kanak, they felt their enemy slowly growing unfocused. The speed with which the red flesh spread diminished a little, and the movements of the titanic abomination grew faintly sluggish. And as they stood their ground some more, the difference slowly became more pronounced, until it was easily noticeable. The flesh of Kanak was weakened by the curse, which allowed the dream curse to take root in its consciousness faster, which, in turn, made it weaker still. Contained by Nephi's flame and undermined by an insidious synergy of Sunny's powers, the great Titan fell into a vicious cycle, and once it did, there was no escape. The gargantuan nightmare creature, which had been slowly advancing south, became completely immobilized by the devastating rain of black javelins. The sea of red flesh, which had been straining to drown out the wall of white flames with its ghastly mass, started to recede. The northern part of the island had been completely destroyed by then. The ground was shattered and pulverized, then melted into lava and swallowed by the lake. Billowing clouds of boiling steam and swirling ash were washed away by the ice-cold rain, and deafening thunderclaps echoed above the ruins as enormous waterfalls crushed the eternal city into dust in the distance. The Shadow Legion had wiped out most of the remnant wraiths by then, allowing its champions to join the fight against the flesh of Kanakhet. Saint arrived first, reshaping her tenebrous blade into a great bow made of pure darkness. Fiend rose from the shadows and gleefully dove into the towering wall of white flames. His steel body turned incandescent, and he unleashed his own infernal flames upon the receding sea of undulating flesh. Slayer ignored her grievous wounds to draw the string of her bow against the faltering great titan. Neve used the last of his essence to pierce the limbs of the titanic fiend with towering spikes of azure ice. And lastly, Jet faced one more nightmare creature. From the scattered fragments of Kanakhet, shredding its flesh with a storm of enchanted shurikens. Their combined assault slowed the great titan down, then halted its advance completely. The red sea of flesh was pushed back and incinerated, receding until it disappeared altogether. Only the gigantic, hideous mountain of flesh that was the nightmare creature's main vessel remained. Nephi's, Sunny, and their companions continued to deal it an unimaginable amount of damage. The power of sovereigns, saints, and supreme shadows descended upon it like an annihilating guillotine, tearing the gargantuan body of the flesh of Kanakhet apart over and over again. It was truly an assault worthy of destroying a great titan. Sunny even caught himself feeling quietly awed by their terrifying show of force. And yet, how is this even possible? The flesh of Kanakhet refused to die. It refused to be irrevocably wounded, even. Its body and soul continued to repair themselves, enduring an unfathomable amount of punishment with no visible effect. No matter how terribly the great titan was mangled and mutilated soon enough, it was entirely unscathed again. It stayed alive. And it was still alive by the time the dream curse pulled him into the embrace of deep, unnatural slumber. That was how the eternal city was conquered. What was left of it, at least. Chapter 27, 14 Fury of the Sea. This is a first. Standing on the ruins of the palace island, Nephi's gazed at the huge, motionless figure of the flesh of Kanakhet. She had released her transcended form, becoming human again. Her eyes were dim and tired, the white flames that had burned in them long extinguished. However, the fire dancing on the rubble still reflected in their beautiful gray depths, so there was little difference from how they had shone before. The great titan was asleep. It lay on the bed of ash and molten lava, lulled into deep slumber. Sunny and Nephi stood some distance away, surrounded by their companions. They had poured everything they had into destroying the titanic nightmare creature, but it was all for naught. Finally, after utterly exhausting themselves, they stopped. Nephi's turned and glanced at Sunny. I have never met a nightmare creature whom I could defeat, but not kill. Sunny stared at the slumbering titan with a peculiar expression. Yes, indeed. His mind was still reeling in the aftermath of the calamitous confrontation. The siege of the Eternal City, the mad rush to the Palace Island, the stand against the Dutchman and its Wraith Armada, and finally the battle against the flesh of Kanakhet. All of it had happened so recently and so rapidly in quick succession. So he was failing to fully acknowledge both what had happened and that it was all but over. I don't think I've ever been in this situation either. It was preposterous, really. Usually, a battle ended when the enemy was dead. Killing the enemy was synonymous with achieving victory. One could win a bloodless victory, of course, but defeating an abomination and still failing to kill it was a bizarre novelty. Sunny regarded the flesh of Kanakhet silently. The thing was still alive. It had been captured by the dream curse, but even now that nightmare was a supreme terror. The maze of harrowing dreams was not going to hold a great titan indefinitely, or even for long. The ghastly nightmare creature was going to shake off its slumber eventually. So what do we do with it now? Nephi's hesitated for a few seconds, then glanced into the distance. The distance was not that far anymore. The barrier surrounding the Eternal City was failing. In fact, the rate of its destruction had been increasing exponentially. By now, a dozen hexagons composing the invisible dome blinked out of existence every moment, unleashing roaring waterfalls of dark water. The outer ring of the ruin had already been swallowed by water, so now, it seemed as if a black wall was closing in on the palace island from all sides, erasing the world as it drew closer and closer. The inner ring was half gone, too, and there were even several hexagonal pillars falling into the turbulent lake. Nephi's let out a quiet sigh. "Do we need to do anything?" She remained silent for a moment. The terrible weight of the storm sea will soon descend upon the sleeping Titan. Even if the abomination survives the pressure, it will most likely be immobilized. And even if it retains the ability to move despite carrying the entire storm sea on its shoulders, it might not ever find human citadels scattered in the waters far east of here. If it does, decades would have passed. The sea is vast, after all. Decades later, we will either be strong enough to vanquish it once and for all, or dead. Sonny glanced at her incredulously. "So are you suggesting we just leave it?" He glanced at the monstrous, towering mass of the flesh of Kanakit, Nephi's jet. And Neve glanced at it too, which meant that Cassie was watching as well. Nobody said anything for a while. Eventually, it was Nightmare who broke the silence, letting out a quiet snort and glaring at the mountain of bleeding flesh with smoldering hatred. Nephi's and Sonny did not react, and yet remained her usual self too. However, Neve and Fiend could not help but shiver at the sound of the harrowing Destrier's voice. Considering that Fiend was dozens of meters tall, that was quite the sight. Sonny shook his head. "I guess that is." His voice was drowned out by the ferocious roar of rushing water. High above them, several vast swaths of the dome vanished at the same time, and innumerable tons of foaming water plummeted down from great height. The world shook when the water reached the ruins, devastating the islands closest to the lake and erasing the southern end of the palace island from existence. This time, the damage was not limited to those islands alone. The very foundation of the Eternal City seemed to have reached its limit, fracturing with a deafening noise. Several of the remaining islands crumbled and collapsed into the seething canals, revealing where the enormous fractures were hidden. Those fractures spread outward from the point of failure, and most of them converged on the palace island. The palace island crumbled as well. Crap. Suddenly, Sonny realized that the flesh of Kanakit was not the real problem. The great Titan had been defeated, so even if they failed to slay it, that was all in the past. The current peril facing them was the Eternal City itself. Having broken it, they now had to survive its destruction. The decision on how to deal with the flesh of Kanakit had been made for them. It's time to escape. As the ground opened beneath their feet, Nephi summoned her wings again. Sonny grabbed Jet and Neve, pulling them through the shadows. A moment later, they appeared on the walls of the dark castle. It was leaning heavily to the side, perched precariously on the edge of a deep chasm. Far below, the dark expanse of the deep fracture was quickly filling up with foaming water. Ignoring it, Sonny pushed his companions toward the graceful silhouette of the chain breaker. He forced out a smile, then grinned earnestly. "My fellow treasure hunters, I hereby announce the completion of the Eternal City expedition. It was a resounding success. Thank you for joining me on this fun and mildly amusing adventure. You both performed admirably. Now we just need to escape this sunken hell alive." Neve gave him a startled look. "What?" Before he could finish, Sonny pointed at Cassie, who was already landing on the deck of the chain breaker. "Follow her, I'll join you as soon as I can. If I can, in any case, go." Sparing one glance back and making sure that Nephi's was already ascending to the Ivory Island, Sonny pushed them one more time and stepped into the shadows again. As soon as he left them, his gaze landed on his charred incarnation, which was still stitching the wayward shadow of Nightwalker back to its master amid the devastation. "You fool, what's taking you so long?" His figure separated into 4 identical avatars, each glaring at the fifth with the same indignation. "Why are you so slow, bastard? We have defeated an entire Wraith armada and a great Titan while you were dawdling around. What the hell? Do you see all this water? We hate water." As more of the dome collapsed, unleashing an apocalyptic deluge, Sonny gritted his teeth and glanced at his other incarnations with seething fury. "Shut the hell up, wretches." He paused for a moment and then growled. Since you're already here, pick up a needle and help out.